Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The wind howled outside the small, isolated weather station, a shrill and relentless cry that seemed to gnaw at the very fabric of the building itself. Jonah sat alone in the dimly lit room, the faint hum of old machinery and the crackling buzz of his outdated equipment the only sounds filling the air. His fingers traced the edges of the weather station's cold metallic desk, his breath rising in slow, frosty clouds with every exhale. Outside, a storm like none he had ever seen churned across the Alaskan wilderness. He had been stationed at this remote outpost for 2 years now, far from the comforts of civilization. The endless snowdrifts, icy winds, and isolation were both his colleagues and his adversaries. Yet tonight, something about the storm unsettled him. It wasn't just the severity of it, no. It was the way it seemed to move with purpose. A twisting, unnatural force that clawed at the edges of the world. Jonah's eyes flickered over the myriad of data readouts on his monitors. The storm's progress was erratic, too erratic for any conventional weather patterns he had studied in his years of meteorology. As the storm intensified, so too did the loneliness. He had known what he was signing up for when he agreed to be the sole occupant of this station, monitoring the weather at the edge of the world, but that didn't make the isolation any easier. The station had been built decades ago, a relic of old government-funded projects that no longer had any purpose, but to sit in silence, gathering dust and whispers. Jonah had become accustomed to the way the walls creaked, the lights flickered, and the furnace groaned in its ongoing battle against the cold. His hand hovered over the radio receiver, an old piece of equipment that had long been deemed obsolete. He knew it was probably only good for picking up interference at best, but it had been a source of curiosity for him since his first days at the station. The frequencies, much like the weather itself, were unpredictable and often nothing more than empty static. Still, there was something oddly comforting about the possibility that something might break through the silence, no matter how fleeting. Jonah reached for the receiver and turned the dial, listening to the gentle hum of static fill the room. For a moment, the sound of the storm outside blended with the noise from the radio, creating a sense of eerie harmony. He flicked the dial again, half expecting the same dissonant bursts of white noise. But then, in the midst of that static, something else appeared, something human. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" The voice was faint, barely audible above the crackle of the radio. Jonah's hand froze in midair, his pulse quickening. The voice sounded distant, unsure, as though it was struggling to be heard. But it was a voice, human in nature, and Jonah's heart skipped a beat. Who could be out there in the middle of this storm? The nearest town was hundreds of miles away, the roads impassable. No one should be out there, certainly not anyone, in distress. He adjusted the dials with a nervous haste, trying to catch the frequency more clearly. The voice continued, a mix of urgency and desperation. "Please help. We're lost. In the storm. Can anyone hear me?" Jonah's fingers trembled as he pulled up the tracking data on his screen. It was instinctive, driven by years of training. He began to cross-reference the frequency with the known coordinates of any nearby stations, hoping to make some sense of the message. His eyes widened as the coordinates appeared on his screen, a set of numbers that led him directly to a place he hadn't even thought about in years. The coordinates pointed to an old ranger outpost, a facility long abandoned, its last occupants having left more than 50 years ago. Jonah's stomach tightened as he stared at the screen, uncertainty crawling up his spine. The storm outside had begun to howl louder, the winds battering the station's windows as if answering the radio's call. He leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass as he looked out at the storm, hoping to see some sign of life, some answer to the voice that now filled the air. But the outpost, that wasn't supposed to be there. The structure had been decommissioned and forgotten long ago, reduced to little more than a decaying memory. Why would someone be out there, alone, lost in the middle of a storm like this? Jonah's heart skipped a beat as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He felt a pull, a sudden need to know more, to uncover the truth behind the voice. Against his better judgment, he keyed in the coordinates and began running a search. The result was the same: the abandoned ranger outpost, nestled deep in the wilderness, isolated and untouched. It was a place that hadn't seen human activity in decades. His hand hesitated as he stared at the flashing red marker on the map. The storm outside seemed to intensify in response, as though the weather itself were reacting to the discovery. He glanced at the radio again, his breath catching in his throat as the voice crackled back to life. "Jonah, please, can you hear me?" The voice said his name. It was unmistakable, clear as day, and filled with an odd familiarity. It was not a generic plea for help. It was personal. The voice on the other end knew him, but how? He ran through 1,000 possible explanations in his mind. Static interference, some old emergency broadcast system malfunctioning, maybe even a prank, but none of them seemed plausible. There was something too real about the voice, too distinct. It wasn't just the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't just the storm outside. Something was out there, something calling to him, and the very fact that it knew his name sent an icy ripple of fear through him. "Who is this?" Jonah finally called out, his voice shaking, unsure whether he expected an answer. There was a brief pause, a moment where the silence seemed to stretch out, as though time itself had stopped. Then the voice returned, slower this time, almost as if it were gathering its strength. "Jonah, you have to come. They're waiting for you. Don't let them take me." The words sent a cold shiver down his spine, and the air in the room seemed to grow even colder. His breath clouded in front of him, visible and thick against the oppressive chill. The radio's crackle seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Jonah stood, his body stiff, his mind racing. What did the voice mean? Who was waiting for him? Why was he being drawn to this place, this outpost that had been abandoned for half a century? As he scanned the room for some semblance of explanation, the storm outside reached a new pitch, the howling wind mixing with the increasing urgency of the voice on the radio. "Jonah, please. They're coming. You can't stop them alone." The air in the room thickened, suffocating, like something was watching him from the darkness. Something was waiting, just beyond his reach. Something ancient, something tied to the land, to the storm itself. Suddenly there was a sharp rapping sound against the wall, startling Jonah from his thoughts. His head snapped around. The station was surrounded by nothing but a relentless sea of snow and ice, no sign of any movement outside. He stepped cautiously toward the window, his mind still racing. But as he peered out, he saw nothing but the swirling blizzard, the heavy snow obscuring all but the vaguest hints of the world beyond. Yet the knock came again, louder now, closer. Jonah's eyes widened as he turned toward the door. The sound of the knocking reverberated in his bones, hollow and ominous. No one was supposed to be out there. No one could reach him in this storm. He quickly glanced down at the radio, half expecting the voice to offer some explanation, some reason for the knocking, but the air was filled with only static. The storm outside seemed to grow more frantic, the wind screeching louder and more ferocious, as if it were closing in around him. The knocking came again, closer now, as if someone, something was standing just outside, waiting. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, unsure of what to do next, his pulse pounding in his ears. Who or what was out there? And how did they know his name? The storm outside was no longer just a natural phenomenon. It was alive, thrumming, with an energy all its own, and it was getting closer. Jonah stood frozen, his back pressed against the wall as the knocking echoed louder against the door. His breath was sharp, his chest tightening as if the very air around him was growing heavier. The storm outside had grown so violent that the windows shook in their frames, but it was the sound of the knocking that truly rattled him. Each rap felt like a hammer against the very foundation of the station. Jonah's eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, no sign of movement. No footprints in the fresh snow outside. The storm had obliterated all traces of life. And yet, the knocking persisted, rhythmic and unnervingly deliberate. He forced himself to move, inching closer to the door, his hands shaking as they hovered over the knob. Each second felt like an eternity, and despite the cold from the blizzard outside, beads of sweat dotted his forehead. Every instinct told him to run, to lock himself in a room and hide, but his curiosity, no, something deeper, compelled him to open the door. He had to know what was on the other side. He had to understand this feeling creeping down his spine like ice water. A tremor of uncertainty ran through him as he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the doorknob. The knocking stopped. Just like that. Silence. Jonah stood still, his breath coming in short bursts, waiting. He strained, his ears listening for any sound, any hint that the source of the knocks was still there. The storm raged, its howls a constant background to the eerie stillness. He opened the door slightly, just enough to peek outside. The snow was blinding, swirling in chaotic patterns as it was thrown into the air by the violent winds. The world, beyond his doorstep, had been swallowed by the storm, the landscape a blur of white, impenetrable and alien. Nothing. His heart sank in his chest. There was no one there. The air felt too thick, too unnatural, as if it held its breath alongside him. Jonah stepped out, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, eyes scanning the surroundings. The wind tore at his face, icy needles digging into his skin, but there was no sign of life, no footprints, no other sign that anyone had been near the station. The storm had erased all traces. Then, without warning, the voice on the radio returned. It was louder this time, more urgent, and as familiar as before. A chill ran through Jonah's entire body as the voice once again called his name. Jonah. You have to listen. They're closer now. He stumbled backward, his hand still clutching the doorframe. His breath caught in his throat, and his mind raced. The voice, who was it? Why did it keep calling him? The storm outside, the knocking, the voice on the radio, it all seemed to weave together into something he couldn't quite understand, something far beyond the predictable patterns of nature he had spent his life studying. He rushed back inside, slamming the door shut behind him as though the storm could follow him inside, and he wasn't sure it wouldn't. The radio crackled again, the familiar, haunted voice seeping through the static. Jonah, you have to come. You're the only one who can hear me. Jonah stared at the receiver, his hands still trembling. The hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention. The storm outside was no longer just a natural occurrence, a weather phenomenon. It was something else entirely. Something was happening, something he couldn't explain, and it was reaching out to him. The radio's voice was too specific, too personal. It was as if the entity, whatever it was, knew him, had been waiting for him. The connection between the storm and the voice seemed more tangible now, as if they were somehow linked. Jonah's breath fogged in front of him, his body suddenly feeling much too warm for the freezing cold that filled the room. The walls seemed to close in, as if they too were listening, waiting for him to act. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. All he could do was listen, hoping that the voice would offer him some clarity, but instead it spoke again. Jonah, you can't trust them. They won't stop. You have to come." He froze, his blood running cold. The voice didn't just sound desperate anymore, it sounded afraid. And that realization hit him like a physical blow. Fear. The voice, this entity, was terrified. What could it be afraid of? And why did it? Need him, specifically to help? Suddenly, the world outside the station seemed even more alien. The blizzard, so thick it swallowed up the horizon, was no longer just a storm. It had become a malevolent force, something alive, something that didn't belong in the natural world, something that had wrapped itself around the old ranger outpost, and now, Jonah. He could feel it now, in the way the air shifted, in the suffocating silence that followed every burst of wind. The voice on the radio crackled again, a desperate cry. "Jonah, please, they're coming for you." Jonah's heart hammered in his chest as he fumbled with the equipment. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening. With shaking hands, he accessed the station's ancient records, pulling up any reference to the abandoned ranger outpost. He pored over old documents, outdated files, notes scribbled in the margins of maps. But nothing made sense. The outpost had been abandoned decades ago. No one had lived there for over 50 years. No one had been there. But the coordinates, the same coordinates that had led the voice to him, were real. "Who are you?" Jonah finally demanded into the radio, the words almost choked in his throat. "Who's out there?" For a long moment the radio was silent, as if considering his question. And then it crackled again. "They were supposed to die there. You weren't meant to find me." Jonah's blood ran cold. He didn't know what it meant. Didn't understand. The voice, so full of terror and pleading, was only leaving him with more questions than answers. What were they? And why had they been waiting for him? And who were these they the voice spoke of? The words tangled in his thoughts, a knot that grew tighter with each passing moment. "Why me?" Jonah whispered, feeling the weight of the question settle heavily on his chest. The storm raged louder now, a deafening roar that seemed to echo through the very walls of the station. "You are the last. You can stop them." Jonah stared at the radio, the hairs on his neck prickling once again. He didn't know what was real anymore. The storm outside was no longer just the unpredictable fury of nature. It was the beginning of something else, something much darker, more dangerous, and it seemed to be calling him directly, drawing him into its twisted embrace. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for him, had been calling to him all along. He turned back to the window. The storm was a living thing now, clawing at the station's fragile walls as if trying to get inside. The wind whipped around the building, its force almost suffocating. But Jonah felt something deeper than just fear now, a creeping, gnawing sensation that told him that he couldn't ignore this, not anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed, he couldn't escape it. And then the knocking returned. It wasn't at the door this time, it was inside the station. There was no mistaking it. Soft, deliberate knocks echoed through the building, coming from somewhere behind him. The walls trembled with each rap. Jonah's eyes widened. The sound was closer now, closer than ever before. Something had crossed the threshold. Jonah's heart hammered in his chest, a sickening rhythm of panic that drummed in his ears. The knocking came again, louder this time, and he felt the vibration in the floor beneath him. His mind raced. He couldn't move, couldn't think. His body was rooted to the spot, as if the very air itself had grown too heavy to push through. He turned slowly, the cold sweat on his palms making his fingers slip as he gripped the radio receiver tighter. The knocking wasn't coming from the door anymore. No, it was coming from inside the station. The walls seemed to be closing in around him, and for a moment Jonah thought he could hear a whisper in the stillness. Something was wrong. No, everything was wrong. The storm outside wasn't just wind and snow. It was alive, sentient, and it had been waiting for him. The voice on the radio had called out to him, reached for him across the static. It had known his name, as though it had been watching him long before that first distress call. His breath hitched and he forced himself to move. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let whatever was knocking, whatever was trying to get in, have the upper hand. He needed to understand. The need to know. To piece together the mystery, to make sense of the storm's malevolent force. The voice was overwhelming. Jonah turned back to the monitors, his fingers moving almost of their own accord as he accessed the coordinates again, his mind not fully processing the weight of the situation. The numbers flashed on the screen, the coordinates that had led him to the abandoned ranger outpost, the same outpost that had been untouched for over 50 years. But there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. Jonah had seen these coordinates countless times, had studied the maps and weather data for months. But now, a new secondary marker blinked into existence. Jonah's pulse quickened. This marker hadn't been there before. It wasn't part of the old map. It was something else. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and with a trembling hand, he zoomed in on the new location. His eyes widened in disbelief as the secondary marker led to an even more remote spot, an unmarked area deep within the wilderness. It was a place he hadn't known about, a place that didn't exist on any map he had ever seen. His mind screamed for him to stop, but the curiosity, the insatiable need to know more, propelled him forward. He dug deeper, pulling up the data on the ranger outpost itself. Old records, yellowed with age, appeared on the screen, the ink fading with time. He scrolled through the names of previous rangers, the reports of their duties, the mundane notes about weather patterns, the occasional mention of strange wildlife or odd occurrences in the area. But nothing explained what had happened to the outpost, or why it had been abandoned in such haste. Then Jonah came across a name, one that seemed to leap off the screen at him. Paul Vickery, a ranger who had been stationed at the outpost in the late 1960s. He had written detailed reports about his time there, and according to the last entry, he had been alone at the outpost when something had gone wrong. Jonah felt his pulse quicken as he read the entry. Vickery's handwriting was frantic, the words spilling across the page in jagged lines. His last report described the storm, much like the one Jonah was experiencing now, but it was different. Vickery spoke of hearing voices on the wind, of seeing shadows move in the corner of his eyes. The journal entry grew more incoherent as it went on. The storm wasn't just a storm, it had become something else entirely, something alive. Jonah read on, his eyes darting over the pages. Vickery had written that he had heard the knocking, the same repetitive sound that Jonah had experienced. And then, the final entry. It was barely legible. The ink smeared as if Vickery had been in a hurry. It knows my name. It's calling to me. I can't escape it. The storm, it's not just a storm. It's a thing, a force, and it's coming. For me, it's already here inside in the walls. Please, someone... The rest of the entry was nothing but jagged scribbles. Jonah slammed the journal closed, the overwhelming sense of dread nearly suffocating him. It was all connected. The storm, the outpost, the voices, the knocking. Paul Vickery had experienced it all before, 50 years ago, and now Jonah was living through the same nightmare. But what was this thing? What had Vickery discovered, and why had it driven him to such madness? His eyes returned to the monitor, where the coordinates to the abandoned outpost blinked back at him. The storm outside had reached a deafening crescendo, the wind howling against the building as if it too were caught in the grip of some ancient terror. Jonah turned back to the radio, the voice still crackling, its tone urgent and pleading. Jonah, please. They're here. You're next. his breath caught in his throat. The voice. It had spoken again, but this time it wasn't just a plea for help. It was a warning. The storm wasn't merely weather. It was something far darker. Something that had been waiting in the cold, watching, growing stronger with each passing year. Jonah's mind reeled. The voice, the storm, the knocking. It was all too much. He had to get to the outpost. He had to find answers. But what would he find there? Would the storm finally consume him, as it had consumed Vickery? Or was he the key to stopping it, as the voice suggested? The air inside the station had grown thick, like the walls themselves were pressing in on him. The knocking had stopped for now, but Jonah could still hear it, echoing in his mind, reverberating in the pit of his stomach. His gaze moved back to the map, the blinking coordinates taunting him. It was too much to ignore. He had to go. Jonah grabbed his coat, his mind made up. He didn't have all the answers, and the storm outside was far too powerful to attempt an escape. But something inside of him was pulling him toward the abandoned outpost. The coordinates had spoken to him, the storm had spoken to him, and the voice on the radio had called his name. The connection was undeniable. And so, with one last glance at the station that had been his refuge, Jonah stepped out into the storm. The wind bit into his skin, the snow stinging his face as he made his way through the wilderness. Each step felt heavier, as though the very air was thick with the weight of what was to come. His mind kept returning to the name Paul Vickery, to the fate that had befallen the last ranger to be stationed at the outpost. The storm had claimed him. Would it claim Jonah too? The wind roared in Jonah's ears as he trudged through the blinding whiteout, each step sinking deeper into the ever-shifting snowdrifts. The cold gnawed at his bones, a biting chill that seemed to come from inside his body rather than from the outside world. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, the air too thin to be comfortable, the cold too fierce to ignore. The storm was no longer just an environmental hazard. It was a living, breathing thing, pushing him, pulling him, wrapping its icy fingers around his very soul. Jonah pulled his collar tighter around his neck, squinting through the chaos of swirling snow. The world had become a smothering mass of white, the landscape utterly unrecognizable. The world beyond the narrow bubble of his thoughts was lost, swallowed whole by the storm. Yet the coordinates kept drawing him forward. He didn't know what he was looking for or what he hoped to find when he reached the abandoned outpost. The voice on the radio had called to him, pleading for help, no, begging for it. And then the last words it had spoken to him echoed in his mind, haunting him with a clarity that made his heart race. "You're next." Each repetition of that sentence sent a cold shiver down his spine. He wasn't prepared for what awaited him, and part of him wished he had never answered the radio at all. But it was too late for regrets. Jonah could not turn back now, not with the storm howling around him, not when the voice seemed to follow him with every step. The outpost should have been miles away, but the storm had disoriented him, stretching distances in strange ways. What should have been a short hike through the wilderness felt like a journey into another realm entirely. It was as if the storm had a mind of its own, distorting reality, forcing Jonah deeper into its grasp. It was then, in the midst of his disorientation and growing dread, that the voice returned. "Jonah, you're almost here. Don't turn back. Not now." Jonah froze mid-step. The voice. It wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was in his head. The voice rang out with an intensity he had never experienced before. He glanced around, disoriented. There was no one. There couldn't be anyone. The radio was tucked securely in his jacket pocket, buried beneath layers of clothing. His breath hitched, his heart pounding louder than the wind itself. The storm was no longer the only thing that seemed to be alive. The voice was everywhere. It was as though it was woven into the storm itself, a part of the wind, a whisper in the crackling static that hissed in his mind. The storm had known him, had been waiting for him. But why? The realization made Jonah's stomach churn with something far darker than mere fear. It was familiar. The voice had called his name before. But it wasn't just a stranger's voice, it was someone who knew him, someone who knew him too well. "Who are you?" Jonah called out into the storm, his voice barely carrying above the howl of the wind. "Why are you calling me? What do you want?" There was a moment of silence, just a moment, before the voice responded, and when it did, it was slower, more deliberate. The words felt like they were wrapping around him, suffocating him from all sides. "I am you, Jonah." The chill that washed over him was not from the cold. It was an emotional wave, a suffocating sense of recognition. He staggered, his footing slipping in the thick snow, and grabbed at his jacket to steady himself. What did it mean? "I am you. From a time you left behind." Jonah's mind reeled, his breath became erratic. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring blindly into the storm. The voice had just said something that shook him to his core. Something personal. Too personal. It was as if the storm had reached inside him, pulling out the deepest parts of himself that he had buried long ago. The voice sounded familiar, but how? He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words in his gut. The storm, the entity, whatever it was, it had known his grief, his loss. But how? Jonah's thoughts scattered like the snow swirling around him. There were memories buried deep inside his mind, memories of a time he wished he could forget, of a past he had tried to leave behind. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind scream around him, its fury echoing in his ears as he braced himself against the rush of conflicting emotions. And then it clicked. There was one person whose voice, whose memory, haunted him more than any other. His brother, Adam. Adam, the by. Memory struck him like a physical blow, the pain of it coursing through his veins. The night Adam had disappeared into the wilderness, chasing something he had heard in the storm, something that had been calling to him. Jonah had never told anyone about that night, about what he had really seen, what really happened. Adam had gone out into the storm, just like this, and had never returned. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with terrible clarity. "Adam?" Jonah whispered, his voice thick with disbelief, fear, and something darker, a deep gnawing guilt. "Is that you? Is this your voice?" There was no answer for a long, agonizing moment. The storm howled louder, the wind whipping through the trees like a living thing, as if waiting for something to break. Finally, the voice responded. But it wasn't Adam. It wasn't even human. "It's not him, Jonah. Not anymore." The coldness in the voice was enough to freeze him in place. The words felt like daggers. The realization hit him like an avalanche. Adam wasn't lost. He had never been lost. He had been taken by the very same storm, the very same force that had been calling to Jonah from the beginning. The storm had taken Adam, just as it was, now trying to take Jonah. Jonah stumbled backward, his chest tightening with an overwhelming sense of dread. The wind picked up, whipping at his skin, and the snow blinded him. Everything seemed to spin in a whirl of disorienting white, a storm that was no longer merely weather, but something far darker, something older, something that had a claim on him. He could hear the voice again, echoing through the storm, like it was speaking not to him, but through him. "You are the next one, Jonah. You were always meant to be." Jonah's pulse thudded in his ears, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt as though the very storm was pressing in on him, suffocating him with its icy grip, wrapping around him like a cocoon. He wasn't sure if he was hallucinating, if the storm had finally driven him mad. But one thing was clear: the storm had known him all along. He was no longer just a meteorologist, isolated at a forgotten outpost. He was a part of it. The storm had chosen him, just as it had chosen Adam. And now, Jonah had to face it, face the horrifying truth of what had happened to his brother and what the storm was trying to do to him. And then, through the whirlwind of howling wind and biting cold, a new sound pierced the storm, the unmistakable rhythm of knocking. Soft at first, but then louder, clearer. Jonah's body tensed. He turned his head toward the direction of the sound, the abandoned outpost. It was close now, so close. The knocking was calling him in. Jonah's legs felt as if they were made of stone as he continued through the snowdrifts, each step becoming a battle against the force of the storm. The howling wind was no longer just a nuisance. It was a physical force, a living thing that seemed to wrap itself around his limbs, tugging him back, pulling him deeper into the wilderness, deeper into the storm's grasp. The snow, thick and blinding, swirled in angry vortexes, creating a wall of white that he could barely see through. Every time he lifted his foot, the snow seemed to pull it back down, as if it didn't want him to go further. His breath came in labored bursts, fogging up his goggles as he fought to keep his bearings. The knocking, the sound that had been echoing through his mind for what seemed like an eternity, was growing louder. It wasn't just a faint noise anymore, drifting in from the edges of his consciousness. No, it had become a rhythmic thud, a deliberate and insistent knock that matched the pounding of his heart. It was coming from somewhere ahead, beckoning him forward, urging him toward the heart of the storm, toward the outpost. Jonah could barely think anymore, the overwhelming cold dulling his senses, the wind howling so fiercely it seemed to claw at his thoughts, at his very soul. He could feel something in the storm, something other than the weather itself, an oppressive, malevolent presence that pressed down on him with every step, tightening its grip on his chest. The fear that had been gnawing at him since he first heard the voice on the radio had now become something much darker, something more tangible. It was as if the storm had reached inside of him, feeding on his fear, drawing strength from his terror. "Why me?" Jonah whispered to the wind, his voice carried away in an instant. "Why is this happening?" There was no answer, only the constant roar of the wind and the relentless drum of the knocking. His mind screamed for an explanation, for some kind of clarity, but the storm only responded with silence and a deeper sense of dread. The land was empty, completely empty. There were no signs of life, no footprints in the snow that would suggest anyone else had been here. And yet, something was here. Something had been here for far longer than he could imagine. The outpost loomed in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was a shadow against the white world, a dark, hunched shape that seemed to grow larger with every step. Jonah took toward it. The closer he got, the more suffocating the air became. The storm seemed to press in on him from all sides, closing off any escape, drowning him in its cold, eternal grip. Jonah stumbled forward, the last vestiges of his resolve cracking under the weight of the storm. And then, as if in response to his fear, the storm changed. The howling wind stopped suddenly, completely stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Jonah's heart thudded in his chest, his breath coming out in jagged, ragged gasps as he came to a halt. He felt the change in the air immediately, the sudden silence pressing in on him from all sides, a suffocating quiet that was unnatural. The snow, which had been swirling in chaotic gusts, now fell in perfect, unbroken sheets, as though the storm had paused, holding its breath. But there was something far worse than the stillness. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if it were vibrating with some unseen force. Jonah glanced around, feeling an unshakable sense of being watched, of being listened to. There was no reason for the storm to have halted so suddenly, no logical explanation for the calm that now surrounded him. And yet, there it was. The stillness, hung like a heavy shroud. And then the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't the voice from the radio. This voice was different, closer, colder, and more insistent. It seemed to come from all around him, not in his mind, but in the very air, in the breath of the storm itself. Jonah. He froze in place. It was unmistakable. The voice. He knew it now. It wasn't Adam, it wasn't a familiar voice at all. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with an echo of something ancient, something that had been slumbering in the earth, buried in the heart of the storm for decades. You shouldn't have come. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The voice, the thing, was real. And it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a force that seemed to live and breathe in the wind, in the earth beneath his feet. He could feel it now, pressing down on him, crawling under his skin. It wasn't something that simply existed. It was alive, and it was aware of him. It had been waiting for him. Jonah staggered back, his mind spinning. He could feel the storm pulling him, forcing him toward the outpost, the place that had become a monument to this unnatural force. He wanted to turn back, to run, to flee, but he couldn't. It was as if the storm had taken control of his legs, guiding him forward with each step, with every breath, toward the place where it had all begun. The knocking resumed. No longer a rhythmic tap, but a deafening bang, as if someone, or something, was pounding on the walls of the outpost, trying to break free, trying to pull Jonah into its grasp. The sound was almost deafening now, reverberating in his chest, in his bones, and his mind. The storm had turned violent again, whipping the snow into frenzied spirals, the wind returning with renewed fury. But it wasn't just the weather. The storm had taken on a life of its own, an entity that had attached itself to the very land, to the outpost, and now to Jonah himself. The outpost was now looming directly ahead. Jonah couldn't stop himself, couldn't force his body to turn around, no matter how hard he tried. He felt the storm driving him forward like a puppet on a string, pulling him toward the door that had been knocked on for so long, the door that had already opened to something else. His legs burned with exhaustion, his breath came in ragged bursts, but his feet moved forward without his consent. The outpost seemed to rise out of the snow, its broken structure towering over him like a monument to despair. The knocking was deafening now, loud enough to drown out the roar of the storm itself. Bang, bang, bang. He was there, at the door. Jonah raised his shaking hand to the door, his fingers trembling with cold and fear. The knocking stopped. Complete silence followed, an unnatural quiet. His heart pounded in his chest, as if it too had stopped in time with the storm. The air was thick with tension. Jonah opened the door. The hinges creaked, the sound like a scream, in the suffocating quiet. And as the door swung open, the storm's roar returned, as if it had been waiting for him to enter. Inside, the outpost was frozen in time, untouched for 50 years. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the scent of rot. The walls, cracked and splintered, seemed to breathe with the weight of some ancient secret, something that had been waiting for Jonah to step inside. The knocking began again, louder now, insistent. But there was something else now, something worse. A shape moved in the shadows. Jonah stood in the doorway, his breath frozen in a thick mist before him. The storm outside howled as if it had given up the pretenses of being natural. Its ferocity, now a living thing, one that bled into the very walls of the outpost. The air inside the building was suffocatingly still, a silence so deep it made his ears ring, the sound of his own pulse drumming in his skull. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by the knowledge that he had crossed a threshold, He could never uncross. The door creaked shut behind him, the wind rattling the frame like an animal pacing at the gate. Jonah's heart thudded in his chest, a rhythm that matched the drumming of the storm outside. He blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the low light of the outpost, the dim glow from a single flickering light bulb, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the cracked wooden floor. The space was small, barely a room and a half wide, yet the emptiness of it seemed to amplify the weight of the air inside. It was as though time had stopped here, trapped in the years of decay. And then, as if to answer the question that had been building in Jonah's mind, the knocking came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the gentle tap of wood against wood or the rattle of ice on metal. This was something far more deliberate, far more menacing. A solid thud followed by a pause, then another, each one louder than the last. It echoed through the abandoned space, vibrating in his chest and rattling his bones. Jonah spun around, his eyes wide with terror. The sound wasn't coming from the door, as he expected. It was coming from behind him, from deeper within the outpost, where the shadows clung, like cobwebs, where the darkness seemed to pulse with some unseen energy. His breath quickened as he stared into the blackness, his mind racing to piece together a rational explanation. But none came. His feet moved without thinking, driven by a primal fear, a need to escape, to make sense of what was happening. But the knock came again, closer this time, as though someone was walking towards him in the dark. The space was small, claustrophobic even in its decay. There should have been nowhere for anyone to hide, yet the knocking moved as if it were a living presence, shifting in real time, circling him, getting nearer. Jonah's hand reached for the flashlight at his side, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal. He snapped it on, the beam slicing through the dark like a blade. The light flickered for a moment, then steadied, casting long shadows across the room. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the floor littered with debris, abandoned, equipment left to rot in the corner. Nothing. No signs of life, no footprints, nothing to explain the pounding that now filled the space. Then it came again. Another thud, unmistakably louder. Jonah's heart lurched in his chest. The knock had come from the farthest corner of the room, an old wooden cabinet that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The air around it seemed thicker, heavier, as if the very presence of the outpost itself was pushing against him. Knock, knock. His body jerked at the sound and his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn and run. He wanted to flee back, into the storm, into the unknown. Anything but face whatever this was. But his legs wouldn't move. His feet were frozen to the spot as his eyes locked onto the cabinet. The knocking wasn't random anymore. It had a pattern. It was like a countdown, a deliberate rhythm, an invitation to something ancient, something that had been waiting in the cold silence of this outpost for far too long. Jonah took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam of light wavered, casting distorted shadows across the room. His mind screamed at him to stop, but he could no longer ignore the need to know, the desperation to understand what was happening. Why had the storm called him here? Why had it chosen him? As he neared the cabinet, the temperature dropped, the air growing colder, as if the shadows themselves were seeping into him. His breath came out in visible puffs, but the freezing chill wasn't from the storm. It was coming from the corner, from the cabinet. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't wood on wood anymore. It was something else, something wet, fleshy, and sickening. A bone-deep thud that reverberated in the floor beneath him, in the walls around him. The storm outside was nothing compared to this. Jonah reached the cabinet, his pulse racing as he placed his hand on the cold, decaying surface. The wood groaned beneath his touch, the smell of mildew and rot filling the air. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as he forced himself to open the cabinet door. It was empty. completely, utterly empty. His heart sank in his chest, confusion flooding his thoughts. The knocking, the sound, it had come from here, hadn't it? The empty space seemed to mock him, but just as he was about to turn away, there was a shift in the air. A crackling noise, faint at first, then growing louder, filling the room with a horrific hum. It came from beneath him. His eyes dropped to the floor. The old floorboards creaked under his feet, and in the flickering light he saw something moving just under the boards, something alive. The light was dim, but there were shapes, shadows, squirming beneath the surface, writhing like worms, pressing against the wood, scraping at it. The knocking wasn't in the corner anymore. It was beneath him, beneath the very floor of the outpost, trying to break through. Jonah's mind swam in panic. He had seen enough. He knew now that whatever this was, it wasn't just a storm. It wasn't just a haunting. It was alive, a malevolent force that had been waiting for someone, waiting for him, to open the door, to cross the threshold. Whatever had trapped Paul Vickery here, whatever had twisted this place into something unnatural, was still here, buried beneath the floorboards, festering in the darkness. The knocking came again, this time louder than ever, as though whatever had been waiting for Jonah was reaching through the very fabric of the building itself, eager to claim him. And then the sound shifted. The knocking wasn't coming from the floor anymore. It was coming from behind him, from the walls. Jonah spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. There was no one, nothing, in the room with him. And yet he could feel it, the weight of something moving behind him, something watching him from the shadows. The knocking grew frantic now, its rhythm wild, erratic, like a heart beating faster and faster, as if in fear, as if something inside the outpost was coming to life. The wind outside howled once more, louder than ever. Jonah's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he backed away from the walls, his feet stumbling over the debris in a desperate bid to escape. The storm was no longer just a storm. It was an entity, a force that had awakened, and it was closing in on him. But then the worst sound came of all. The floor beneath his feet creaked again. But this time it wasn't just the wood. It was the sound of something rising from the earth itself, something pushing through the floor, something alive. And then the knocking stopped. The silence was unbearable. Jonah stood in the middle of the room, breathless, as if the storm had consumed all sound, all life, all air. His chest ached from the cold, but the most chilling part of it was that, amid the silence, he could feel it. It was waiting. It was waiting for him to make the next move. Jonah stood frozen in the middle of the room, the silence pressing against him like a physical force. His chest heaved with each breath, the air thick and suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm outside had fallen into an unnerving stillness, as if the winds themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The knocking had stopped, but its presence still lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. It was like a living thing, one that had been pacing around, him circling in the shadows. His pulse raced as the dark corners of the room seemed to close in around him. The outpost, so forgotten and abandoned for so long, now felt impossibly small, claustrophobic. The weight of it pressed down on him, pulling at him from all sides. Jonah's fingers clenched and unclenched, his hands slick with cold sweat, the flashlight shaking violently in his grip. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm, the force that had brought him here, was alive, and that it wasn't just the wind or the knocking that had been calling to him. It was something deeper, something ancient. And then the voice came again. This time it wasn't a faint whisper or a far-off cry through static. It was clear, present, so close that it felt like it was inside his skull, reverberating against his bones. Jonah. He jerked backward, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound of his name echoed in his ears, bouncing off the walls in a way that was almost unnatural. He had heard this voice before, the one that had been calling to him through the radio, the voice that had spoken his name in the storm. But now, this voice was different. It wasn't pleading anymore. It wasn't the frantic, desperate cry for help. It was something worse. It was calm. It was cold. "Jonah, you've come to the wrong place." His breath caught in his throat. The words were slow, deliberate, like a taunting whisper that dragged itself out from some forgotten depth. Jonah felt the cold seeping deeper into his skin, down to his very bones, as if the air around him was growing thicker, heavier. The voice wrapped itself around him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. "Who?" Jonah gasped, the words escaping him in a hoarse whisper. He could feel the air around him growing denser, suffocating him with its weight. "Who are you?" "You know me, Jonah." The voice was familiar. It was that same sense of knowing, the same deep, unsettling feeling he had felt since the first moment. The storm called to him. "I've been waiting for you. We've been waiting for you." The phrase hung in the air, dripping with a cold, hollow finality. Jonah could feel his mind unraveling, his sense of reality slipping, as if the storm itself had warped the very space around him. He took another step back, but his legs felt weak, unsteady. The walls were pressing in. The ceiling seemed lower than it had been just moments ago, the edges of the room closing off. Jonah's head spun. "Why?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper now, the question on the tip of his tongue. Why was this happening to him? Why had he been drawn here? To this forsaken place, to this storm? What was the connection between the outpost, the voice, and him? "Why me?" The voice chuckled. Not a laugh, a rasp. It was the sound of something old and broken, like bones scraping against one another, like the very essence of decay. "Because, Jonah, you're the last." The voice drew out the words slowly, like a teacher explaining a harsh lesson to a reluctant student. The last to hear the call, the last to understand what is happening here. Jonah's chest tightened, his breath coming out in sharp gasps as the voice grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't in his head anymore. It was in the room with him, echoing in the walls, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. "Who are you?" Jonah's voice cracked, the terror and confusion choking him. "I am the one who calls to you. I am the one who watches." The voice deepened, reverberating like an endless echo, filling the room. "I am the storm, Jonah, and you've come to understand what we've always wanted, to become one of us." Jonah staggered backward, his mind reeling. The storm? The storm was speaking to him. It was alive. No, this didn't make sense. This couldn't make sense. He had come here to escape, to understand the storm, yes, but he had never imagined it would be like this. He had thought, no, hoped. It was just a freak weather pattern, something that would end once the storm passed. But it wasn't. The storm was the entity, the force, and it was waiting for him, drawing him in. A sense of horror, of terrible realization washed over him. "You came here to escape, Jonah," the voice crooned, the edges of it filled with something dark and patient. "But there is no escape. Not for you. Not for me. We are together now." Jonah's mind spun. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his feet wouldn't move. He felt trapped, like a fly caught in a spider's web, struggling to break free but only pulling tighter. The storm outside wasn't just a storm, it was alive. And it had been calling to him, pulling him toward it for years. A sudden sharp crack split the air, louder than anything he had ever heard. His eyes snapped to the floor, where the boards beneath him creaked and shifted, the wood groaning under some unseen weight. It wasn't the storm's wind anymore. No, this was something else, something coming from within the very building. something pulling at the foundations. Jonah. The voice whispered again, this time lower, softer, like a lover's taunt. You have to understand. You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to listen. The storm, it needs you. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The walls seemed to breathe with him, expanding and contracting as if the building itself were alive. And every fiber of his being screamed to escape. But there was nowhere to go. And then it hit him. The storm, the voices, the knocking, the feeling of being trapped, of being watched. It was all tied to him. His past. The guilt he had buried, the brother he had lost. The storm had chosen him not by accident, but because of something deeper, something personal. You are the last, Jonah. The final piece. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. The air became impossibly cold, colder than the blizzard outside. Jonah's breath came out in thick, visible clouds as ice began to form on the walls, creeping toward the center of the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, grow taller, darker. His legs finally gave way, and Jonah collapsed too, his knees, the cold seeping into his skin like poison. He gasped for air, but the air was thick and suffocating. The knocking began again, not from the walls, but from beneath him. It was a rhythmic, terrible knocking, a knock that felt like it was coming from inside his body, deep inside, from the core of his soul. Jonah's hands trembled as he pressed them against the floor, his nails scraping against the cold wood, feeling the vibrations of the storm echoing up through the boards. The room was closing in on him, suffocating him, drowning him in its unrelenting presence. And then the voice, his voice, spoke one final time. And this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a roar. You are one of us now, Jonah. The walls shook. The air howled. The storm outside welcomed him. And the last thing Jonah heard before everything went dark was the sound of the knocking, louder than ever before. The world spun in a blur of snow and shadows, the air thick with an unnatural cold. Jonah's senses were fraying, slipping between reality and nightmare. His breath came in shallow, erratic gasps, each exhale forming misty clouds in the freezing air that had overtaken the room. The storm outside, still raging as if it had a mind of its own, seemed to be closing in, wrapping its icy fingers tighter and tighter around the station, around him. But inside the outpost, it was worse. The silence was worse. Jonah's body trembled from both fear and the biting cold that had begun to seep into his skin, down to his very bones. His knees scraped against the cold, splintered wood of the floor, and his hand, still pressed against the floorboards, began to ache from the weight of the vibrations that coursed through the building. The knocking had stopped, but in its place was a horrible, stomach-churning silence, a stillness that was unnatural in its depth. The air hung thick with tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to hold on to the fragments of reality that were slipping away. The voice, his voice, had spoken again. It had told him he was one of them, one of the storm, one of the forces that had been waiting for him. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed his brother, Adam. The name twisted in Jonah's mind like a jagged shard of glass. The storm had taken him. The storm had drawn him into the wilderness and claimed him, just as it was now claiming Jonah. And now, Jonah knew the terrible truth. The storm wasn't just a force of nature. It was something much older, much darker. It was a thing that fed, that grew from fear, from isolation, from the need to belong. He forced himself to his feet, his legs weak beneath him, and stumbled toward the door of the outpost. The storm howled like an animal just beyond the threshold, but Jonah could feel it. The storm wasn't the only thing that had been waiting. The outpost, This place was alive in its own twisted way, feeding off the terror that clung to the walls like cobwebs. The knocking had stopped, but the presence of the storm remained, a sickening, pulsing thing that was both inside and outside of him. Jonah needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening, why the storm had chosen him. His breath came ragged as he fumbled for the flashlight at his side, the dim beam barely piercing the darkness of the room. He wasn't sure why he was still moving, why he hadn't just collapsed in terror on the floor. But something deep inside of him, some spark of defiance, of desperation, kept him going. The voice had claimed him, but it hadn't broken him. Yet, he still had a chance to find out what was really going on. With his flashlight illuminating the jagged edges of the room, Jonah moved toward the small desk in the corner, its surface covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. He pulled the chair out with a screech that seemed to echo far too loudly in the silence. As he dug through the papers strewn across the desk, his fingers brushed over old maps and weather reports, faded and yellowed with age. None of them gave him any answers. There was nothing here that made sense. The only thing that stood out was a worn, leather-bound notebook, its pages frayed, its spine cracked, as if it had been handled too many times. His breath caught as he opened it. The handwriting inside was slanted and erratic, the words scrawled across the pages in a frantic rush. He could feel the tension in the ink, the unease in the hurried scrawls, as if the writer had been running out of time. Jonah's eyes traced the words, trying to decipher them through his growing sense of dread. The first pages were mundane, listing observations about the weather and the surrounding terrain. Nothing unusual, but as he flipped further into the notebook, the entries grew more disturbing, more real. The writer, Paul Vickery, had started documenting strange occurrences, things that defied logic. There were mentions of unexplained whispers on the wind, shadows that moved where no light could reach, and a presence that seemed to follow him. At first, Vickery thought he was simply losing his mind. But as time went on, the reports became more desperate. "The storm is not just weather," one entry read. "It's something else, something ancient. I can feel it in my bones. It's alive. It watches." Jonah's fingers shook as he turned the pages faster now, his pulse quickening. The entries became increasingly incoherent, full of fractured thoughts, jagged lines, and half-sentences. Vickery had begun to believe that the storm itself was a living entity, something that fed off fear, off loneliness. It had drawn him in, as it had drawn Jonah now, and the only way to escape was to stop the storm from feeding. But Vickery didn't know how. "It knows my name," Vickery had written in his last entry, his handwriting barely legible. "I don't think I can escape. It's here. It's in the walls. It's in me. It will take me." Jonah felt his throat tighten. The terror in Vickery's words mirrored his own, the sense of being swallowed whole, the knowledge that the storm was more than just a storm. It was alive, and it was still here, waiting for Jonah to become part of it. A sound broke, the stillness sharp and sudden. Jonah's head snapped up, his body rigid with fear. It was the knocking again, louder, closer. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the door. He turned toward the door, his flashlight beam trembling in his hand as he slowly backed away from the desk, the old notebook still clutched in his hand. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, each strike of the door sending a tremor through his chest, through his very bones. No. He could feel it now, crawling up his spine, twisting in his gut. The storm was no longer just a physical presence. Outside. It had followed him inside. It had always been inside. Jonah's mind spun in dizzying circles, trying to hold onto the thread of logic, the thread of his own humanity. He needed to get out. He needed to run. but his legs wouldn't move, his body wouldn't obey him. The storm had claimed him already, and there was no escaping it. The knocking continued, relentless. It called to him, beckoning him forward, to the door that had been knocked on for so long. Jonah's hands shook violently as he reached out for the doorknob, but before he could turn it, the door creaked open on its own, as though it had been waiting for him. And there, standing in the doorway, was the shadow of something tall, something alive. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he gazed into the dark, seeing nothing but feeling everything. The storm had been waiting for him, and now there was no escape. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through Jonah's very soul, its groan a quiet symphony of anticipation. The storm outside had finally stopped its fury, but a thick, oppressive silence had taken its place. Jonah's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced around the room, and his breath formed cold clouds in the stagnant air. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Jonah stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the doorway. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see what was on the other side of the door, but he couldn't stop himself. The dark shape in the doorway seemed to pulse with life, its edges indistinct, as if it were half-formed from the shadows themselves. His heart hammered in his chest, and the terror that gripped him was so visceral it almost paralyzed him. Every part of his being screamed to run, to escape, but his legs refused to obey. The presence was unmistakable. It was there. But what was it? The storm had been calling to him. No, it had been pulling him into this very moment, guiding him toward the outpost, toward the doorway. And now that he was here, he didn't know what to expect. Was it human? Was it the storm, taking shape, becoming something real? Something that had always been waiting for him? The cold air seemed to press against his chest as he took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking underfoot. An almost deafening sound in the suffocating silence. The flashlight trembled in his hand, casting a shaky beam of light toward the figure standing motionless in the doorway. As the light touched the shadow, it shifted. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, its shape long and thin, almost skeletal. The thing in the doorway seemed to stretch, its form warping as though the very darkness of the room was pulling it into itself. The shadows clung to its figure, blending it into the inky blackness behind it, until it was impossible to tell where the creature ended and the storm began. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, an eerie, milky white, like the reflection of moonlight on ice. There were no pupils, no warmth in its gaze. It stared at Jonah with an emptiness so profound it made his skin crawl. Jonah's heart beat in a frantic rhythm, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his throat had gone dry, the words choking in his chest. He didn't know what to say to something that wasn't supposed to exist. The air grew even colder, the temperature dropping to an almost unbearable chill, and the thing in the doorway did nothing to reassure him. It remained motionless, a dark sentinel standing between Jonah and whatever lay beyond. And then it moved. Not in the way a person would. It didn't walk, didn't shift its weight. No. The figure glided, its long limbs sweeping through the air with an unnatural smoothness, as if it were floating. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Jonah's quickened breath and the oppressive, unyielding weight of the creature's gaze. The knocking, the rhythmic, maddening sound that had followed him from the very beginning had ceased entirely. There was only the stillness now, a silence that pressed down like a heavy stone, and the ever-present dreadful feeling that something was waiting. Jonah took another step back, but the figure didn't advance toward him. Instead, it remained, Just at the edge of the door, its faintly glowing eyes locked onto him, watching. It was as if it were waiting for him to make the next move, as if the storm, the force that had summoned him here, wanted him to choose. A cold gust of wind swept through the outpost, though the door remained closed. The storm outside, too, seemed to have stilled, as though it had become something separate, something foreign to this place. There was no sound, no sign of movement from the figure, only the oppressive silence and the increasing pressure building inside Jonah's chest. What was it waiting for? Jonah's mind raced. His thoughts blurred, confusion and terror gnawing at him from all sides. The voice, the storm, the knocking, the figure. It was all one twisted, horrible pattern. It had been waiting for him. But why? What did it want? Chilling realization swept over him like a wave. The voice had been his own. It had called to him. It had drawn him here. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was part of it. The storm, the force. It had been tied to him from the very beginning. It had chosen him. The figure in the doorway seemed to acknowledge his realization, its head tilting slightly, the milky white eyes gleaming with something like recognition, something that chilled Jonah deeper than the cold air ever could. It was no longer an alien presence, no longer something outside of him. It was tied to him. Jonah's legs trembled beneath him, and his grip on the flashlight faltered. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. All he could do was watch as the figure, this thing, this creature that had been waiting, slowly stepped forward, its feet making no sound against the floorboards. There was no warning, no movement to indicate it was coming. It was as though it had always been there, woven into the fabric of the room, of the station, of the storm. And then it spoke. Its voice was not like the voice he had heard before, the one that had whispered his name. No, this voice was deeper, more resonant, vibrating through Jonah's very being. It wasn't a voice of words, but a feeling, a deep, resonant hum that threaded through his chest, through his soul. You are the last. The words felt like a physical blow, the cold reverberating through him. It wasn't just a statement. It was an invitation. Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears. The last? The last of what? The last to hear the storm? The last to face it? The figure's shadow seemed to stretch and bend, its limbs elongating as it took another step closer. Jonah could feel the pressure building in the air around him, a heavy, suffocating force pressing against his chest. His vision blurred, his breath shallow, and his mind spun in a whirlpool of confusion and dread. He could feel it. Whatever. This thing was, whatever it represented. It had taken root in his soul. He was part of it now, and there was no going back. The creature's head tilted again, and this time, Jonah felt the weight of its gaze pressing into his mind, searching. It was as if it were seeing him, really seeing him for the first time. Jonah. It wasn't his name that echoed in his mind this time. No, it was something else, something darker, more profound. The force, the storm, the voice. It had all been leading to this moment, to this confrontation. Jonah had been chosen, and now, standing in the presence of whatever the storm had become, he had to make a choice, to accept it, to become part of it, or to defy it. But Jonah didn't know if he could. The creature, the storm, whatever this was no longer an external force. It had become part of him, woven into the fabric of his very being. And Jonah, in that moment, realized there was no escape. There had never been. Jonah's mind was a haze of confusion and terror, a swirling vortex of thoughts that refused to form into anything coherent. The creature in the doorway, whatever it was, hadn't moved, but its presence, its awareness, pressed down on him with the weight of an entire storm. The air around him was thick and suffocating, cold, colder than the blizzard outside, colder than anything he had ever known. It was the cold of something ancient, something beyond understanding, something that existed outside the rules of nature. The creature's eyes, those milky, empty orbs, remained locked on him, watching, waiting. Jonah's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as his body trembled, his skin clammy and cold. His legs felt like they were made of stone, his feet unwilling to move, unwilling to even think about running. The door behind him, the door he had just entered through, felt miles away, though he had only crossed a few paces. The room, the outpost, the storm, it all seemed to close in around him. There was no escape. There was no other place. He was trapped in the presence of this thing, in the grip of whatever force had been waiting for him. The voice, deep and resonant, surged within him again, echoing through his thoughts. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was feeling, pressure, awareness. The voice had become part of the very fabric of his being. He could feel it like a pulse in his veins, like his heartbeat in time with it. It knew him. It understood him. It was a part of him. "You know who I am," the voice whispered through his thoughts, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring each word. "You've always known." Jonah's chest tightened. The voice, it wasn't just speaking to him now. It was inside him, inside his very soul. He wanted to scream, to tear at his skin, to escape the oppressive weight of it, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, caught in a snare of ice and fear. "You've always known," the voice repeated, like it was coaxing him, like it was trying to make him understand something vital. "You feel it, don't you? The storm isn't just outside you, Jonah. It's in you. It always has been." Jonah's mind spun in dizzying circles, the fog of panic making it impossible to think. The storm, the voice, the knocking. It was all the same. It had been waiting for him, not just to hear the call, but to understand it, to accept it. Suddenly, a sharp pain lanced through his chest, and he gasped, his body seizing in a wave of sharp, cold agony. It wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper, something inside him. It was as if his very soul was being stretched thin, pulled in 1,000 directions at once. The creature didn't move, but Jonah could feel it, feel the weight of its awareness pressing into him like a hand on his chest, suffocating him from within. "I know what you are, Jonah," the voice murmured, almost tenderly, as though it were speaking to a long-lost friend. "You've hidden it from yourself for so long, haven't you? You thought you could outrun it, forget about it, but you can't." The room around Jonah seemed to shift, the walls bending inwards, the air thickening and growing colder. His vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into shadows. The storm outside was a distant hum now, a far-off thing. All he could hear, all he could feel, was the voice, the thing that had called to him from the beginning, the thing that had known him from the start. "You know who I am," it repeated, more insistent now. "And I know who you are. You can feel it, can't you? The storm. It's you, Jonah. It's been inside of you for as long as you can remember." The words cut through him like a blade, slicing open his memories, exposing the darkest corners of his mind, the parts of himself he had tried to bury. The storm, the creature, was more than just a force. It was a mirror. It reflected the truth he had never wanted to see, the truth he had been running from his whole life. "You're not just a witness," the voice whispered, now an intimate caress in his thoughts. "You are part of it. You were always part of it." The room spun, the shadows lengthening, the walls pulsating with the force of the voice. Jonah's breath came in ragged gasps as the pieces of his past began to fall into place, aligning with a terrifying clarity he had never expected. His mind, once a sanctuary of confusion and terror, began to piece together the broken fragments of his life. Adam, his brother, the one he had lost in the storm, the one who had been taken by the same force, the same storm that had haunted them both. Adam had never been lost. He had been chosen. He had been claimed, just as Jonah had been claimed. The creature in the doorway didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, almost loving in its intensity. It didn't need to speak. It knew Jonah's thoughts, his memories. It had always known them. It was inside him, a part of him, pulling the strings. It had been feeding on him for years, whispering to him, drawing him closer. Adam, Jonah whispered, the name a tremor on his lips, his voice a mix of grief and horror. He wasn't lost. He was taken, the voice completed for him, a cold smile in the words. Just as you will be, just as you always were meant to be. The room seemed to close in on him, the storm outside a distant hum, the walls pressing in, suffocating him. Jonah could feel the weight of the truth crushing him. His brother had never disappeared into the wilderness. He hadn't died. He had become a part of it, just as Jonah was now. The storm, the creature, whatever it was, it had always been inside him, whispering to him from the darkness, calling him to this moment. Jonah closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on him. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, the cold filling his lungs. The room spun, and he couldn't tell where he ended, and the storm began. He had come here to escape, to find answers, but he had never been meant to escape. The storm wasn't just out there. It had always been inside him. He had always been part of it. You know what happens next, the voice murmured, almost tenderly, as it had been from the beginning. You become one of us. You join us. You are no longer alone. Jonah's body trembled violently as the cold took him, his vision blurring, his thoughts dissolving. The last remnants of his resistance, of his fight against the storm, slipped away. There was no more Jonah. There was only the storm. Jonah's vision blurred as the room around him seemed to collapse inward. His limbs grew heavy, like weights pulling him deeper into the suffocating cold that had wrapped itself around him like a shroud. The storm, the creature, the voice, they were all one now. A collective presence that was no longer outside him, but in him, entwined within the very marrow of his bones. The knocking had ceased, and the silence in the room was now deafening. His breath came in sharp, painful bursts as the truth settled in, cold and unforgiving, deep within his chest. He had been chosen, just as his brother Adam had been. The storm was not a phenomenon. It was a living thing, a force that fed on isolation, on fear, on the breaking of the human spirit. It was ancient, older than the earth itself, and it had claimed both of them. The storm had never meant to destroy. It meant to consume, to make them part of it, to pull them into the cold, endless void of its existence. The cold had been growing unbearable, gnawing at his flesh, until Jonah could no longer feel his extremities. His mind, too, seemed to fray, like a thread unraveling in the wind. But in the haze of pain and terror, something broke through. The storm was pulling him toward something, toward the heart of it, the core of whatever this was. And it wasn't just the storm. It was the outpost, the place that had been abandoned for decades, the place that had once been a refuge for the rangers. But it wasn't a refuge anymore. The outpost had been its home. And now Jonah was being dragged toward it. He staggered, forward, unable to control his body, as though the force of the storm had taken over his limbs. The flashlight, which had been shaking violently in his hand, now barely illuminated the narrow space in front of him. His feet scraped against the old wooden floor, and every movement felt like wading through thick, icy sludge. Each step took him closer to the door, closer to the reality that had once been so distant, so unfathomable. The outpost had been abandoned for 50 years, and yet it had always been waiting for Jonah, waiting for someone to come to the place where the storm began. The door in front of him groaned as he reached it, as if the building itself was sighing with a deep, ancient regret. Jonah hesitated, his body trembling, his mind at war with itself. He had seen the creature in the doorway. He had felt the storm inside him. But what if the outpost still held answers? Answers to questions he hadn't even been able to form. He had to know. With one last weak breath, Jonah pushed the door open. A gust of freezing air hit him, colder than the storm outside, and the room he stepped into seemed like an unholy reflection of the storm itself. The walls were covered in frost, their surfaces slick with moisture. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, remnants of a once functional base that had long since rotted away. The air in the room was thick with dust, but beneath that there was something else, a stale, stagnant scent of something that had been sealed off for too long. Jonah's eyes darted around, and that's when he saw it. A row of tall, frozen shapes against the far wall. Figures, long dead rangers, their bodies preserved in ice as if the storm had frozen them in place. Their eyes were wide open, their faces pale and frozen in expressions of terror and confusion, their bodies stiff and unmoving. Their uniforms, now cracked and yellowed with age, clung to them like the remnants of a past they could never escape. Jonah froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He wanted to turn away, to run, to escape the sight of these bodies, these trapped souls. But his legs refused to move. He could feel the storm closing in on him, could sense the weight of the entity that had claimed these men, these rangers, and now it was turning its eyes on him. He forced his gaze away from the frozen figures and into the heart of the room. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, deep carvings that Jonah couldn't recognize. They were old, older than the outpost itself. They were worn into the wood, like something had scratched them into the very bones of the building. There was a rhythm to the carvings, a pattern that spoke to him in ways that made his skin crawl, as if they were speaking directly to his mind. The storm was alive, and it had always been alive. The outpost was its anchor, its point of origin. The storm had fed on the souls of the men who had come here, drawn them in like moths to a flame, and kept them here, trapped in the ice, frozen in time. The symbols were not just marks, they were bindings. The storm's power, its ability to claim those who heard its call, was anchored in these very walls. Jonah staggered forward, his mind racing to understand, to grasp what he was seeing. The wind had grown colder, if that was even possible. It wasn't just the storm. The building, the outpost itself, was a vessel, a living thing feeding on the storm's power, maintaining its strength, holding its victims in place, feeding off their terror and despair. The storm had been feeding on the Rangers' fear, and now it was feeding on Jonah's. Jonah turned his attention to the far corner of the room, where an old desk sat, half buried in snow. The chair behind it had collapsed long ago, but something caught his eye. A small leather-bound journal lay open on the desk, the pages yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible. Jonah staggered toward it, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he flipped through the pages, his mind racing with a mixture of dread and urgency. The journal belonged to Paul Vickery, the last ranger to be stationed here before the outpost was abandoned. The entries were much like the ones Jonah had seen before, scattered thoughts, weather observations, and then a shift. As the storm began to grow stronger, Vickery's notes became more erratic, more desperate. There were descriptions of strange sounds, whispers on the wind, shadows in the corner of his eye, things that didn't make sense. But as the days passed, the entries became darker. In the final entry, Vickery wrote, "It's here. The storm is not just a storm. It's a thing, a force. It wants us. It feeds on us, on our fear. I can feel it in my bones. I'm not sure how much longer I can last. There are symbols, carvings on the walls. I think they're the key to stopping it. I don't know how to finish this. It's too late. I'm trapped. Please, help." The rest of the page was covered in frantic, nearly illegible scribbles. Jonah's hands trembled as he closed the journal. His heart pounded in his chest, a deep, rhythmical thudding that seemed to reverberate through the walls of the outpost. Vickery had known. He had known what the storm was, what it wanted, and now Jonah understood. The storm wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a force, an entity that had been feeding on the fear and isolation of those who had come here, and it had claimed the rangers before him. Jonah was next. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Jonah felt the cold seeping into his very soul, wrapping around him like chains. He stumbled back, desperate to flee. But as his eyes turned toward the door, something moved in the corner of the room. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was there, the tall, dark shape that had been waiting for him at the door. This time, it was moving. Jonah backed away, his body refusing to obey as the shadow stretched and morphed, pulling itself from the darkness. The creature's glowing eyes fixed on him once more. And then, in that moment of terrifying clarity, Jonah realized the storm had always been waiting for him, not to destroy him, but to claim him. He was the last piece. The temperature in the room dropped even further, an oppressive cold that gnawed at Jonah's very soul, sinking deep into his bones. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and writhe, warping and twisting like smoke, but they were solid, tangible. The walls, the air, the very space around him felt alive, thick with something that was ancient and hungry. His chest ached as the weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. The creature, the shadow, moved forward with terrifying slowness, its glowing white eyes fixed on him, drawing him into its gaze like a moth to flame. Jonah wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat, swallowed by the cold, swallowed by the growing darkness that filled the outpost. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest with an urgency he couldn't escape. He was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by something deeper, something inevitable. The storm had already claimed him. There was no escape. There never had been. For a fleeting moment his thoughts drifted to Adam, his brother, the one who had been taken by the storm years ago. Jonah had never truly understood what happened to Adam, never fully grasped the truth of that terrible night. Adam had gone into the storm, into the wilderness, just as he had. The storm had called to him too, but unlike Jonah, Adam hadn't come back. Jonah had been left to pick up the pieces of a life that had never truly been whole. But now Jonah understood. He had been called because the storm needed him. The storm had been waiting for him. And in that moment, the cruel clarity struck. Adam hadn't disappeared. He had been claimed, just like Jonah was now being claimed. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting with every step, its long, dark limbs reaching out toward him with a terrifying patience. Jonah felt the air grow heavier, thicker, as if the very fabric of the outpost was closing in on him, pressing against him. The creature's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Jonah felt the truth seep into him. The storm had always been part of him. There was no physical pain as the shadow reached him. There was only a deep, soul-crushing pressure, and icy grip that sank into his very being. It felt like the storm itself had taken root inside him, flooding every corner of his mind with visions of death and darkness. His memories of Adam, his own grief, his guilt, everything became one with the storm. The shadow's presence seeped through Jonah's skin, wrapping around his heart and tightening, squeezing, forcing him to confront the truth he had spent so many years avoiding. The storm had been inside him all along. It had whispered to him, just as it had whispered to Adam. It had been feeding on his isolation, on his terror, on his need to belong. And now, Jonah was being drawn into its heart. He had always been meant to be here. He had always been the last piece of the puzzle. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through Jonah's chest, a pulse of energy that resonated with the storm's power. It was as if the very walls of the outpost were coming to life, the symbols on the walls glowing, faintly flickering like dying embers. The storm outside roared once again, but this time Jonah felt it inside him. He could feel the storm swirling in his veins, twisting through his body, weaving itself into the deepest parts of him. It wasn't just the weather anymore. It was the force that had shaped his life, that had shaped his very being. He had been chosen. He had always been chosen. The shadow drew even closer, its form almost touching him now. The cold was unbearable, like the bite of 1,000 icy knives cutting into his skin. He felt his body stiffen, his limbs locking into place, as if the shadow's presence had frozen him, turning him into something cold, something dead. His vision blurred, the edges of the room dimming, the light from his flashlight flickering in time with the storm's pulse. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. But then, as if in a final act of defiance, Jonah found himself remembering why he had come here. He hadn't just been running from the storm. He had been running from the truth of who he was, of what he had always been meant to become. The storm had been waiting for him to accept it, to realize that he was never meant to escape it. He had always been drawn here, to the outpost, to the storm, to this moment. But as the shadow's presence grew stronger, Jonah felt the terror that had once gripped him begin to fade. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a resignation, a deep, suffocating acceptance. There was no running, no escaping. This was his fate, and it had always been. And then the final revelation broke through him with terrible clarity. Jonah's body jerked with the realization. He was the storm. The storm had become part of him. It had always been inside him, inside the very core of his being. The presence in the storm, the voice that had whispered his name, it had been a part of him. It had been leading him here, to this moment of awakening. Jonah wasn't a victim of the storm. He was the storm. The room seemed to collapse around him, the walls cracking, the air thickening as the storm inside him reached its peak. He could feel it now, the power that had been dormant, buried deep within him, swelling like an untapped ocean of ice and fury. His body shook, trembling violently, as if something ancient was rising inside him. The storm had been feeding on him, on his fear and guilt, on his isolation. And now, it was time. Jonah opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The storm was in him now. He could feel it, feel the tide rising. He had been the last to know, the last to understand. But now there was no turning back. The storm had claimed him. And in that moment, Jonah was no longer Jonah. He was the last watcher, the storm's eternal servant. The room around him disappeared as he was pulled into the heart of the storm, his body disintegrating into its fury, becoming one with the wind, the cold, the dark power that had been waiting for him. And somewhere, far in the distance, a voice whispered his name one last time. Jonah, you are now one of us. Jonah's mind, once so distinct, began to dissolve, fragmenting into the cold, endless winds of the storm. His body felt weightless, as if it no longer existed in the realm of flesh and blood. The cold that had once stung like ice now suffused him, seeping through every fiber of his being until he became part of the storm itself. He could no longer tell where the storm ended and where he began. The lines had blurred, melted away like snow in the wind. The darkness, the emptiness of the outpost, the shadow that had hovered over him, it all seemed to fade, to evaporate like morning fog before the sun. But there was no sun here. The world Jonah had once known, his home, his memories, his life, was gone. The storm had swallowed it all, and in its place was a vast, endless expanse of white, of frozen void. He could feel the storm now, inside him, all around him, a presence that knew him, that had always known him. It was him. It was his essence, his being, and he was no longer separate from it. He thought of the rangers, the ones who had been lost to the storm long before him. Paul Vickery, the last of them, had written in his journal that they were all part of it, that the storm had consumed them, had turned them into something more than human. Jonah had never believed those words, but now he felt them. He felt the cold, the endless howling winds, the presence of something ancient and infinite, something that stretched across time itself. He had become the storm, just as the others had. And in this place, in this endless frozen expanse, Jonah was not alone. His consciousness flickered, like a dying light in the wind, but there were still fragments of himself that remembered. Fragments of Jonah still clung to the periphery of his mind, struggling but ultimately unable to hold on to anything. The storm, the force that had been waiting for him, was pulling him deeper, farther, until there was nothing left of the person he had once been. The storm was not just an entity, it was a prison, a place where souls were swallowed, where memories were erased, where time didn't exist. Jonah was no longer Jonah. He was part of the storm, a shadow of his former self, a broken echo of the man who had once tried to flee from this fate. But now, there was no escape. In the swirling winds of the storm, Jonah could hear the voices of the rangers, Vickery, Adam, all the others who had been claimed by it. They were still here, trapped in the icy, infinite void, their voices blending into a chorus of hollow whispers that echoed through his mind. They were not dead, not fully. They had become one with the storm, just as he was now. The storm fed on them, shaped them, and they had long since lost their identities. They were the watchers now, the eternal, frozen watchers of the storm. They watched as the storm spread, as it moved across the world, calling to others, pulling them into its grasp. The storm's howling voice filled his mind once again, the voice that had been calling him. The voice that had once sounded so distant, so full of desperation, now seemed content, as though it had finally achieved its goal. Jonah had come. He had answered the call. He had been the last to hear it, the last to understand it. Jonah. The voice didn't need to say anything more. Jonah knew. He was the last watcher. The storm had claimed him, and now his soul would remain here forever, a part of the endless, swirling cold. Jonah's mind reeled, but it was futile. There was no fighting it now. There was only the storm, and he was the storm, the outpost. The place where it had all begun was far behind him now, lost to the winds. It no longer mattered. It had been a gateway, a threshold. Jonah had crossed it. He had become a part of the storm's endless cycle, a vessel through which the storm's power would travel. He would watch, like the others before him. Watch as the storm tore through the land, as it pulled more souls into its grasp, feeding on their fear, their isolation, their despair. And as Jonah, now the storm itself, moved through the void, he could feel the whispers of the others who had been lost. He could feel their presence, their endless yearning to break free. But there was no freedom, not here, not in the storm. There was only watching, only waiting for the next soul to be drawn in, the next person to hear the call. Jonah could feel the storm beginning to move again, to spread. It wasn't done. It had only begun to feed on the world, to stretch its icy fingers across the land. There would be more people, more lost souls, more echoes of the storm, and the storm would claim them, just as it had claimed Jonah. But Jonah had become a watcher. The last watcher. The storm had no end. The cold had no end. And Jonah would never escape. As he felt his consciousness slip further into the storm, his final thought was one of cold acceptance. The storm had claimed him, and now he was part of it forever. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The day had begun like any other for the group of hikers, 5 of them in total, setting off into the lush, thick woods of Monongahela National Forest. They were eager to escape the noise and stress of their lives, drawn to the promise of nature's beauty. They spoke little as they ascended the worn trail, too used to the weight of the world to let the beauty of their surroundings soak in completely. Their conversations were muted by the thick canopy overhead, the shadows of the trees casting an eerie light over their journey. The air was thick with humidity, oppressive, as if the forest itself had a pulse. Still, the forest seemed to breathe, in a peaceful rhythm, a rhythm that should have been calming, but felt unsettling. A dark storm cloud had formed just on the horizon, its shape swollen and heavy, but at first none of them paid it any mind. They had hiked these trails before, perhaps not in a while, but they had been here, and they knew the weather in this region could change quickly. A light drizzle began to fall as they trekked further into the woods, soaking their jackets and hats. The rain didn't bother them. It felt almost cleansing at first, soft droplets that kissed their skin and mingled with the scent of the rich earth. But something else shifted then, something they couldn't quite place, a shift in the air, the atmosphere thickening with each drop that fell. The light drizzle quickly turned into a torrential downpour, so sudden and fierce that it made their skin prickle in alarm. They tried to shield their faces as the rain hammered against them like a relentless assault. The forest, which had been so alive with sounds just moments ago, now stood in near silence, save for the harsh rush of water filling the air. Every footstep they took was swallowed by the incessant pounding of the storm, the path becoming slick and treacherous beneath their boots. "Shouldn't we turn back?" asked Ryan, the youngest of the group, his voice rising in panic above the storm's roar. He looked over at Mara, the group leader, for guidance. "No, we're too far in now," Mara said, her words firm, though even she felt a knot forming in her stomach. "We'll push through." There was no immediate danger. The trail hadn't washed out completely, but as the rain intensified, so did their unease. Each step felt more labored, the mud giving way beneath them. The ground, once firm and steady, now shifted beneath their weight, uncertain and unreliable. Trees, heavy with the water, swayed ominously, their limbs creaking and groaning. A deep rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, but it felt too close, too fast, as though the storm had been waiting for them. "I don't like this," Emily muttered, barely audible through the rain, her wide eyes flicking nervously around the darkening forest. She tugged at her jacket sleeves, as though the chill seeping into her bones could be warded off by the small action. "We should have turned back before the storm." Mara gave her a reassuring smile, though it was strained. "We're fine. We're only a couple of miles from the clearing. Just stay close, okay? But it was getting harder to stay close. The path, narrow and often covered by layers of fallen branches, had started to disappear into the rising tide of rainwater. The trail had become an angry torrent, rushing toward them, pulling away the soil as if it were hungry for more. The sound of the rushing water was deafening, a roar that drowned out everything else, and for the first time, there was a real fear in Mara's chest. "You're sure this is the way?" asked Jack, his voice filled with doubt. He looked back, hoping to see something familiar, but the trail behind them was lost in the thickening curtain of water. "We can't keep going like this." "I'm sure," Mara said, though her voice wavered now. She checked her phone again, even though it had no service. She pulled out the group's GPS, hoping to rely on it, but the screen flashed erratically, its lines of data warping, distorting in an almost supernatural way. "We're just off the grid," Mara muttered, more to herself than anyone else. But the words only made the situation feel worse. They were lost in the wilderness, in a storm that seemed to come from nowhere. Mara looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings, but it was useless. The trees that once stood tall and stately were now huddled together, their trunks slick with water, their roots twisted and gnarled beneath the relentless rush of rainwater. The trail they had been following had vanished, replaced by an angry stream that pushed forward, unstoppable. The forest felt closed off, as though it had closed in around them, the darkness deepening under the dense canopy above. A chill, not from the rain but from something else, crept up her spine. She wasn't sure why, but it felt as though they were being watched, followed by eyes unseen. She could almost hear a breath, the sharp intake of something or someone standing just beyond her peripheral vision. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the isolation, the feeling that comes with being lost in a dense, unknown forest. But then, just as she started to feel the creeping fingers of panic closing in on her chest, she saw it. A faint glimmer of light through the trees. At first, it could have been a trick of the rain. A flash of white, no brighter than the flash of lightning in the distance. But there it was again, this time steady, like a light from a lantern, a glow soft but insistent, cutting through the storm. "Mara," Ryan's voice cracked, strained, as he looked past her, following her gaze toward the glow. "What is that?" Mara turned to look, her heart pounding, her throat dry. The glow beckoned, just barely visible through the torrential downpour. It wasn't the flicker of a campfire, or even the glow of another hiker's lantern. This was something else, something strange. Something that shouldn't be there. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence between them oppressive, suffocating. Then, without another word, they began moving toward it. Something in Mara's gut told her they should have turned back right then. But the glow held her, held them all in its grasp. The closer they got, the more the rain seemed to die away. The oppressive rush of water grew quieter, and the only sounds now were the soft squelch of their boots in the mud and the occasional groan of the trees overhead. When they emerged into a small clearing, the source of the light became apparent. Old wooden sign, half buried in the muck. It looked as though it had been there for years, forgotten by all but the forest itself. The faint glow was coming from beneath the layers of dirt and moss, the words barely visible beneath the grime. A chill ran down Mara's spine as she bent to read them. "Turn back before dark." The words were faded, cracked in places but unmistakable. A warning, though Mara couldn't understand why it would be placed so far out in the woods, or who had left it there. "I don't like this," Emily said again, her voice barely a whisper, as if the sign itself was something that could hear her. "Just a marker," Mara said, though her words lacked conviction. "Nothing to worry about." But as she said it, she realized something that made her skin crawl. The light, the glow, hadn't come from the sign at all. There was no source for the strange illumination. It had just appeared, as if the forest itself had decided to shine, a light on the warning. Suddenly, the air shifted again. The oppressive silence deepened. It was no longer the storm that dominated the clearing, but the creeping sense that they were not alone. Something was watching them, and then, in the distance, there was a sound, a splash. A soft, deliberate splash of feet moving through the water. "Did you hear that?" Ryan's voice cracked. They all turned toward the sound, but nothing emerged from the shadows. No one stepped into the clearing, just the sound of splashing feet. Though they were not moving closer, they were standing still, watching. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the splashing grew louder, the rhythm of it steady, deliberate, but unnervingly still. The forest, once heavy with the storm's clamor, now seemed to hush in anticipation, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She turned in every direction, but all she could see were the blurred shapes of the rain-soaked woods, the heavy mist thickening around them like a shroud. "Stop," she said, holding her hand up to signal the others to remain still. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the pounding rain. "Listen." For a moment, nothing but the sound of the storm and the distant rushing of the rain-filled stream. Then, just when Mara thought the splashing had ceased, it came again. Closer this time, closer and then farther. "Where is it?" Ryan's voice trembled with a mixture of frustration and fear, his wide eyes darting around. The splashing wasn't following any pattern. It wasn't moving closer, nor did it seem to be retreating. It was as if something or someone was circling them from the shadows, never coming into full view, but always present, always watching. Mara felt a tightness in her chest, an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia closing in. It wasn't the storm that made her feel trapped. It was the feeling that something far worse was hidden in the mist, just out of sight, lingering patiently. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice sharp. "We can't just stand here, waiting for whatever that is." Mara's heart thudded in her chest, and yet something in her held her in place. Moving, running. It would only draw them closer, wouldn't it? What if it wanted them to move? What if this was part of some sick game? Like the forest itself was playing with them, guiding them towards something they couldn't understand. There was something instinctual in her that screamed at her to stay still, to wait, to not provoke whatever was out there. "Stay calm," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was for her benefit or for the others. "We'll keep going. Let's head back toward the trail and find higher ground." But when she turned to lead them back the way they'd come, she froze. The path they had just walked, familiar, clear, and undeniable, was gone. It wasn't just the rain that had washed it away. The earth had shifted, the trail entirely submerged beneath a now raging river of murky, churning water. The stream that had once been a manageable obstacle had become a torrent, swallowing everything in. Its path, the muddy flood, surged with power, carrying branches, debris, and even what looked like large stones, all tumbling helplessly toward an unseen end. They were trapped. What the hell?" Ryan's voice cracked, his knees trembling. "It was right there." Emily, always the skeptic, walked forward, eyes narrowed as she tried to make sense of the scene. She knelt at the water's edge, peering into its dark, swirling depths. "We must have taken a wrong turn," she muttered. "The trail just isn't visible anymore, but we can't be too far from the clearing." Mara stepped forward, scanning the landscape around them. The trees had once lined the trail, but now they stood as dark sentinels on either side of the vast, unrecognizable floodplain. The air felt denser here, the smell of wet earth and rotting wood mixing with an unfamiliar stench, something faintly metallic, like old rust. It made her stomach churn. "There's no trail here," she said, her voice sharp with a hint of disbelief. This wasn't how it looked before. Jack gripped her arm as he glanced back toward the faintly glowing sign. That sign. It wasn't there earlier, was it? Mara's eyes widened as she turned to look again. The sign, half buried in the muck, remained unnervingly still. But it wasn't just the sign that caught her attention. There was something else in the mist, something faintly discernible just beyond the edge of the clearing. A faint silhouette, standing motionless against the backdrop of the trees. "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "I think we're not alone." And then, in a movement so fluid it could have been an illusion, the silhouette vanished. Gone. The air seemed to thicken, the weight of it pressing against them, pushing in from all sides. The sensation of being watched returned tenfold. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees. It had become something alive, something sentient. The absence of the silhouette was unsettling, but the feeling of being followed, of unseen eyes lingering just beyond reach, was far worse. "We have to move," Emily urged again, her voice nearly breaking. "This is insane. We have to go now." But Mara stood rooted in place, her feet unwilling to move. Something had changed. The earth beneath them no longer felt safe, and the trail they had followed now seemed like a distant dream, something that belonged to a past life. The GPS, which had flickered with erratic static earlier, buzzed again in her pocket, drawing her attention. She pulled it out, but it was useless. The screen had gone black, refusing to offer any answers. The map that had once marked their way forward now showed nothing, only a grey expanse of nothingness, like the device itself had surrendered to the oppressive atmosphere. "What the hell is going on?" Jack muttered. "I don't know," Mara replied, her voice hollow with the weight of the realization that they were lost. "But we can't stay here. Let's go. Let's try to find higher ground." The group began moving, slowly at first, as if the very ground beneath them was uncertain and unreliable. They passed by trees that seemed unnervingly still, their trunks dark and slick with water. The sounds of the forest had gone quiet, the soft rustling of leaves and distant animal calls replaced by a suffocating silence. The only sound that remained was the soft rush of the water and the distant splashing that had not ceased. And then, just as they rounded a bend in the forest, they saw it. A small wooden bridge, barely visible through the dense mist. Mara hesitated, her eyes narrowing. The bridge wasn't marked on their map, and they hadn't seen it when they first entered the trail. Its appearance was sudden and unnatural, as if it had materialized out of the very fog that clung to the forest. "This wasn't here before," Ryan said in a hushed voice. "I'm sure of it." But there it was, a rickety, ancient bridge, its planks weathered by years of neglect. The wood creaked under the pressure of the rain, the beams slick with wetness, but it remained, solid and seemingly untouched by the storm. "We cross it," Mara said, her voice sharp, the words coming out before she could stop them. "We'll try to cross and see where it leads." They crossed one by one, the uneasy silence of the forest pressing in around them. The bridge swayed under their weight, its old bones groaning, but it held, and as they reached the far side, they turned, hearts in their throats, to look back at the bridge. The mist had thickened behind them, swirling into a dense wall, and in the distance they could see the faintest silhouette, the same one that had vanished earlier. This time, however, it did not disappear. It was moving toward them. The sight of the silhouette, no longer a mere shadow but now a solid figure, stopped them dead in their tracks. It was not the shape of any person they had seen before. Its outline was faint, almost ephemeral, like a silhouette cut from a fog. It didn't move like a normal human, its limbs shifting unnaturally, as though it existed in a state of half motion, perpetually fading in and out of their line of sight. "Don't look directly at it," Mara whispered sharply, though she had no clear reason why she spoke the words. Something in her gut screamed that looking at it fully would be a mistake, But the figure didn't seem to care. It didn't need to be seen. It simply was. The group stood frozen on the far side of the bridge, each of them staring at the strange figure that now emerged from the mist. It took slow, deliberate steps toward them, its movement languid, like the ebb and flow of the water that had swallowed the trail. No one moved, as if any movement would break the fragile spell that kept them hidden, watching. "Should we go back?" Emily finally whispered, her voice trembling, but still, it carried an edge of defiance. "We need to leave this place. This whole thing, it's wrong." Mara didn't respond immediately. She didn't know how to respond. The feeling that had taken root in her chest, the cold pinpricks of terror, now turned into something worse, something far more suffocating, something ancient and relentless. The figure didn't even seem to notice them, but its every motion was deliberate, as though it were deciding what to do next. "Where is it going?" Ryan asked, his voice barely audible, though it trembled with growing fear. "Why does it just stand there?" Mara didn't know. The answer lodged in her throat, too terrifying to give voice to. The figure wasn't just standing there, though. It was watching. Even without moving its head, Mara could feel its gaze upon her, feel it burrowing deep inside her chest. The sensation was so strong, so overpowering, that it made her stomach churn. It felt invasive, suffocating, like this thing, whatever it was not simply observing them, but feeding on them, pulling from them, drawing out their energy. "Let's move," Mara said at last, taking a step back. She didn't know what the figure wanted, but staying here was not an option. She turned, motioning for the others to follow her. They continued, stepping away from the bridge, their boots sinking slightly into the muddy earth. The fog thickened around them, and the path, the one they had followed just moments before, was no longer visible. It had been swallowed up by the ever-encroaching flood, replaced by a sea of shifting, turbulent water that churned and roared as though it were alive. Ryan took out his phone, checking it again despite knowing it was useless. The screen flickered. Once, twice, and then it went dark. "Great," he muttered. "Now my phone's dead." Mara pulled out her own phone, and when the screen glowed, she felt a momentary sense of relief. The GPS still worked, albeit erratically. The map shifted before her eyes, flickering with static, making it nearly impossible to discern where they were. She tapped at the screen, growing frustrated. It wasn't just malfunctioning. The trail that had been so clearly mapped out before, marked with bright, clean lines, was now distorted, unreadable. The map was empty, the once crisp lines replaced by a sea of garbled data. Her fingers trembled as she tried to adjust the settings, but nothing worked. "Look," she said, holding the device out for the others to see. "I don't know what's happening, but we've got to stay calm. The map's not responding, the phone's malfunctioning." Emily frowned, eyeing the phone nervously. "That's impossible. It was fine earlier. There's no way it just dies like this." "It's not dead," Mara said slowly. "It's being interfered with. Something's stopping it." The air felt heavy, oppressive. It wasn't just the storm. It was something else. The forest around them seemed to pulse, alive with some unseen force. They had crossed into something deeper now, something beyond the simple storm they had walked into. They had become part of a strange, shifting reality that they couldn't control. And that feeling was creeping in, slowly but surely, suffocating them. "This isn't right," Jack said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "This whole thing, I don't understand what's happening." "We can't keep going like this," Emily added, her eyes darting nervously toward the fog-shrouded trees, searching for any sign of a way out. Mara nodded slowly, a cold, gnawing anxiety taking root in her chest. "We have to keep going. We can't stand here. Whatever that thing was, whatever this is, we can't let it trap us. We need to find higher ground, or at least something that's familiar. We'll stick together." But as the words left her mouth, something strange began to happen. The ground beneath their feet trembled faintly, so subtly that it was almost imperceptible at first. But the feeling grew, the vibrations reverberating through the soles of their boots, through the trees, into the very air they breathed. They all paused, feeling the tremor at the same moment. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something different, something more sinister. And then the trees around them began to shift. At first it was slight, just the faintest rustling in the thick leaves. But then it grew, the trees creaking and groaning, the sound of their trunks twisting and stretching. With unnatural force, the air grew thicker, colder, as if the very forest had come alive, its roots and branches creeping closer, threatening to entangle them. Mara's breath caught in her throat. They weren't alone. "Do you hear that?" Ryan's voice was tight, strained with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "The trees, they're moving." Before anyone could respond, a loud crack rang out through the mist, like the snap of bone, and suddenly, one of the trees nearby began to shift, its gnarled branches bending and twisting in a grotesque fashion, reaching out toward them. "No!" Jack shouted, stumbling backward as he looked at the tree. It wasn't just moving. The bark seemed to pulse with an eerie light, a faint glow emanating from deep within the twisted wood. The leaves fluttered violently as if being moved by unseen hands, the air around them vibrating with an unnatural energy. Mara grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back. "We need to run, now!" Without waiting for any protest, they began to move, no longer in the careful, deliberate manner of hikers, trying to keep pace with the environment, but in full-on panic. They turned back the way they had come, back toward the bridge, but as they did, the fog thickened further, the mist obscuring everything around them. The air grew heavier, the world itself seeming to narrow to a single point. They were trapped, and the oppressive force in the forest was closing in. Ryan checked his phone again, but the screen was now a flickering, distorted mess. The map was gone. The device was utterly unresponsive. How are we supposed to know where to go? Emily gasped, her breath heavy from panic. Mara didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. The forest had become something else entirely, something not just supernatural, but sentient, alive in ways they couldn't comprehend. And just as they neared the bridge again, there was a sound, a loud, wet crack, and the air grew colder still. Behind them, the figure from the mist was emerging again, moving closer, though it didn't. Seemed to be walking, merely sliding through the fog, its form barely held together by the shifting shadows. The faint glow around it grew brighter, its presence pressing in from all sides. "I don't think it's letting us leave," Mara said, her voice filled with a creeping terror. And then the ground beneath their feet trembled once more, violently this time. The trees, the mist, the very air around them, it was all closing in. The figure wasn't just following them, it was hunting them. The world around them seemed to close in on them all at once. The trees, once looming protectors, now felt like sentinels of some ancient, malevolent force. Their twisted trunks stretched toward the sky, their gnarled roots reaching into the earth as though they were ready to pull everything into the ground. The fog had thickened to the point where it clung to their skin, chilling them to the bone, and yet it seemed to push them forward, forcing them to move deeper into the unknown. "Go!" Mara shouted, her voice strained with desperation. "Run!" Without looking back, the group broke into a frantic sprint, their feet slipping on the wet, uneven earth, hearts pounding in their chests as the sound of the splashing footsteps grew louder behind them. They weren't alone. Whatever was out there, whatever was watching them from the mist, was not human, and it was closing in on them. As they pushed through the forest, the fog became more oppressive, clinging to their skin like a wet, suffocating blanket. The trees around them seemed to blur, stretching and bending in unnatural ways, as though the entire forest itself was shifting, alive with malevolent intent. The trail that had once been clear and certain was now a labyrinth of twisted roots and soggy underbrush. The sound of the rushing water from earlier had become a constant throbbing presence, just out of sight, but too close to ignore. The tension was unbearable. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest was pulling them down, trying to keep them trapped in its depths. But the worst part was the feeling that they were being hunted, the sound of the footsteps echoing closer and closer. They couldn't escape. No matter how fast they ran, they couldn't seem to shake the presence behind them. Why won't it stop? Emily gasped, stumbling over a root and catching herself just in time. Her face was pale, streaked with rainwater and mud, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It's like it's following us, but it never gets any closer. Mara didn't have an answer. She didn't understand what was happening. Everything in her body screamed at her to stop, to turn around to face whatever was behind them, but she couldn't. The fear that gripped her was primal, an instinctual terror that pushed her forward, faster and faster, as though running was the only way to survive. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted again, this time more violently. The earth buckled, the trails splintering apart as the rain-soaked ground split with a deafening crack. The path, which had seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them, was now swallowed by a chasm. A deep, black void opened up, gaping wide and threatening to pull them in. The sound of the rushing water grew louder, now mingled with a strange, almost whispering sound that seemed to seep from the very depths of the earth. Mara skidded to a halt, her heart thumping in her chest as she looked over the edge of the newly formed chasm. Below them, the water churned with a ferocity that made the river they had crossed earlier seem tame. The current was powerful, thrashing violently against jagged rocks and twisted roots, as though the earth itself were trying to keep them from escaping. Where do we go now? Jack's voice was tight with panic, his eyes wide as he glanced around. The mist was closing in on them, the trees bending closer, the sound of the footsteps never ceasing. There's no way forward, we can't. Go back, we're trapped. Mara's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and confusion. There had to be something, some way out. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay trapped in the fog, surrounded by whatever was lurking in the trees. Her eyes flicked to the left, and something caught her attention. Through the thick mist, she saw it, a faint outline of something in the distance. A shape that shouldn't have been there. It was an old wooden sign, partially obscured by the rain-soaked undergrowth, its edges jagged and weathered by years of neglect. The sign looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. Its surface, worn and faded, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime and moss. Mara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know why, but the sight of the sign filled her with a sense of both dread and relief. It was a clue, a sign of something familiar, something that could lead them out of this nightmare. Over there, she said, her voice hoarse as she motioned toward the sign. We need to check that. It could be a marker, a way out. The group moved cautiously, reluctant to step closer to the sign, as though it might trigger some unseen trap. But they had no other choice. With the chasm now standing between them, and any hope of escape, they made their way toward the sign, each step heavy with uncertainty. As they approached, the sign became clearer, the faded letters on its surface barely visible. Mara squatted down, wiping the grime from its face, and there it was, the message that had been left for them, the warning that had been hidden in the forest for God knows how long. Turn back before dark. The words were scrawled in a hurried, jagged hand, the paint chipped and worn but unmistakable. A chill ran through Mara's spine. Before dark. The warning was clear. This place, whatever it was, became something else after nightfall, something dangerous, something that wasn't simply a storm or a strange phenomenon, something worse. They had crossed a threshold, and now the full force of the forest's malice had begun to reveal itself. It had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now it had them. "I think we should listen to it," Emily whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't think we have a choice anymore." Before anyone could respond, a sharp, loud crack rang through the trees, snapping through the dense fog like the sound of thunder. It was followed by another crack, and then another. The air seemed to pulse with the vibration of the sound. It was too loud, too close, to be anything natural. Mara spun around, her heart pounding as the forest seemed to react to the noise. The trees around them groaned again, louder this time, bending inward as if something were pushing them toward the group. The mist shifted violently, swirling in all directions, as though it had taken on a life of its own. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, and for a moment, the mist parted just enough for them to see the figure again. It was no longer in the distance. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was taking shape slowly, slowly becoming something real. Its form was dark and indistinct, a mass of shifting shadows. But there were eyes, glowing eyes piercing through the dark. The figure stood motionless, but its presence was undeniable. Mara's heart skipped a beat as she realized with growing horror that they weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The footsteps began again, the splashing steady and deliberate, moving toward them with an eerie, unstoppable pace. "We have to go," Jack said, his voice a hoarse whisper, trembling with terror. "Now, whatever that thing is, we have to get out of here." But the forest had other plans. The splashing grew louder, more distinct, its rhythm heavy and deliberate, as though whatever was following them had no intention of leaving. Mara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic thud that echoed in her ears as the figure moved closer, its steps now undeniable, each one drawing nearer like the slow ticking of a clock in the silence of a darkened room. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This was not a simple chase. This wasn't about distance or speed. It was about something else entirely, something far older, far darker, and far more determined. The figure was close now, too close. A shape, flickering between the trees, obscured by the dense fog. The eyes gleamed in the mist, not just glowing, but alive, moving with a predatory intelligence. The splashing footsteps echoed through the clearing with a mechanical precision, each step taken as if it had been measured over a century of silent waiting. Mara's instincts screamed at her to move, to do something, anything, but her body betrayed her. She stood frozen, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts, her legs like lead beneath her. She was being paralyzed by the fear that gripped her chest, by the sheer unnaturalness of what was happening. This wasn't a normal predator. This wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else. Something that had been born from the depths of the earth, of the fog, of the darkness that thrived in places forgotten by time. She glanced over at the others. Jack's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but even as fear twisted his features, he was still moving, taking a slow, hesitant step backward. Emily, too, looked like a person caught in a nightmare. She seemed to be frozen, her gaze fixed, somewhere over Mara's shoulder, her mouth open in silent terror. Ryan was the only one moving quickly, darting his eyes around as if looking for an escape. "Move!" Mara finally managed to choke out, her voice thin, brittle. "We have to go!" But as she turned to run, the footsteps didn't stop. They hadn't been following them, no. That wasn't right. They had been waiting for them to move. It was as if the footsteps, with their perfect rhythm, were guiding them, ushering them forward, as though they knew the exact path they would take. The figure stepped into the clearing, fully visible now, and Mara's blood turned to ice in her veins. It was no longer a vague, shifting silhouette. It had form, shape, The figure was tall, impossibly tall, draped in tattered, dark robes that billowed around it despite the lack of any wind. The air was still, yet the figure's clothing seemed to move as if caught by some invisible breeze, fluttering unnaturally. The eyes, those glowing eyes, burned with an otherworldly light, piercing the fog like lanterns in a storm. They fixed on Mara first, then moved to each of them, one by one, like they were being weighed, as if each of them were a choice in a cruel game that had been played for millennia. Mara took a step backward, her foot slipping on the slick, muddy ground. She stumbled, but caught herself just in time. The other hikers didn't speak. They couldn't. Their throats seemed clogged with fear. The sound of their breaths was the only thing filling the empty space between them and the figure, but it was drowned out by the constant splashing of the footsteps, now coming from all directions. The fog shifted again, a sickly mist curling and swirling around the figure as though it were an extension of the creature itself. And then it moved. Not quickly, not with the rush of a predator, but with the slow, inevitable pace of something that had existed far longer than any of them could comprehend. "We need to get out of here," Emily whispered, her voice shaking, but her words broke the spell. She turned and ran, the others following suit without a moment's hesitation. They ran through the clearing, their eyes scanning the dark, shrouded forest, looking for some sign of hope, some path that would lead them away from this thing. But there was nowhere to run, no path. The trees seemed to close in on them, each branch an extension of the forest's living grip, blocking their way, squeezing them toward the center of the clearing. The fog thickened again, swirling in unnatural patterns that seemed to swirl toward them, not away. It was as if the forest itself were becoming something else, something they couldn't escape. Mara felt the pull in her chest, an invisible force, as though the very air around them had thickened to the point of suffocation. She gasped, trying to push through, trying to breathe, but the pressure was overwhelming. It was pushing down on her, on all of them. "We can't escape," Ryan said, his voice nearly cracking. "It's like it knows where we're going. Whatever this is, it won't let us leave." The footsteps, once distant, now close, drew in around them from all sides. There was no rhythm anymore, no pattern. It was chaos. It was chaos. Mara's mind raced. Her chest tightened with each passing second. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, the moisture becoming almost thick, oppressive. Her heart pounded so violently she felt as though it would explode. She needed to think, to do something. But what could she do against something like this? This thing wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something born from the dark corners of the world, something ancient, something tied to the very land beneath their feet. Suddenly she realized the footsteps weren't just splashing in the mud. They were shifting, not in the way footsteps usually did. No, these were creating ripples in the fog, in the air itself. The entire forest seemed to shift, the trees bending at angles that were unnatural, their trunks warping, stretching out as if they had no true shape at all. She reached for the ground in front of her and dug her fingers into the dirt, hoping to ground herself, to pull herself free from the chaos. It was the only thing that felt real, the dirt, the earth. For a moment, it felt like the storm itself was pulling everything apart. The very land itself was unraveling beneath her feet. Then, in the distance, beyond the endless wall of mist and trees, Mara heard something that stopped her heart in its tracks. It wasn't the splashing anymore. It was something else. A low, guttural sound that resonated deep in her chest. A hum, like the buzz of 1,000 flies swarming. It was the sound of something massive moving, something that shouldn't have been able to move. And then came the voice. It wasn't a word, not exactly. It was a sound, like a whisper and a scream at the same time. The noise swirled in the air around them, and for a moment Mara was sure she heard her name. Mara. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was deeper than that, feral, guttural, as though it had been pulled from the depths of something ancient and forgotten. "Run!" she screamed, not knowing whether she was talking to herself or the others. They didn't hesitate. They bolted, but there was nowhere to run. No matter how fast they moved, no matter how far they tried to go, they kept circling back to the same place. The footsteps were never far behind, and the fog was getting thicker with every step they took. The voice called again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "Mara." Mara's heart was hammering so violently in her chest that she could feel the pulse in her ears, drowning out all other sounds except for the pounding of her own blood. She had no idea where they were running anymore. The trees, the mist, the muddy ground, all of it had blurred together into one endless, suffocating maze. The path beneath her feet was swallowed by the rising tide, and with each step, it felt like the earth itself was trying to pull her down, drag her under, into the dark abyss that had opened up beneath the forest. The others were running alongside her, though they looked as terrified and disoriented as she felt. Ryan stumbled and caught himself on a tree trunk, his face pale and eyes wide with panic. "It's getting worse. We're not getting anywhere." Emily gasped for air, the cold fog sticking to her skin like wet cloth. "We're just running. In circles. We're not escaping." Mara didn't respond. She couldn't. Every instinct told her to stop, to scream, to beg for help. But the voice calling her name, still faint, still distant, thrummed through her very being. It was pulling her deeper, into the very heart of the forest, toward something, someone, waiting. They stumbled into a small clearing, the trees looming like dark sentinels around them. It was eerily quiet for a moment, save for their ragged breathing and the occasional drip of water falling from leaves above. The storm had let up slightly, but the humidity still pressed on their chests, thick and wet like a heavy shroud. The ground beneath them was sinking, the floodwater creeping steadily higher as though it had nowhere else to go. "That voice," Jack whispered, his voice strained with fear and confusion. "It's like it's coming from inside my head. But it's real, right? It's real," Mara whispered back, her voice hoarse. Her eyes darted around the clearing, the sensation of being watched more intense than ever. The mist rolled slowly around them, thickening with every passing second, as if closing them in. The figure, the presence, was closer now, and Mara could feel it, could almost see it standing there in the shadows. But when she turned her head to look, it was always just out of view. "Keep moving," Mara urged, her words clipped, her pulse racing. "We can't stay here, it's waiting for us." Ryan looked around desperately. "But where do we go? We don't even know where the hell we are anymore." Before Mara could answer, a sudden flicker of light caught her eye, a faint, eerie glow that shone through the mist, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't the same as the light from the old sign earlier. This was different. This light seemed alive, pulsing, almost as if it were breathing. It drew her like a magnet, and despite every warning that told her to stay away, she began to move toward it. "Don't," Emily begged, grabbing her arm. "Mara, stop. It's calling you." But Mara couldn't stop. She didn't want to stop. Every step she took toward the light felt like a weight being lifted from her chest. The closer she got, the less the fear clawed at her. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was something else, a surrender. "Mara." Emily shouted again, but her voice was fading in the distance now, the sound swallowed by the thickness of the fog. When Mara reached the light, she saw it clearly. It was an old, wrought-iron lantern, swinging gently in the breeze, casting a faint yellow glow onto the wet ground beneath it. But the lantern wasn't resting on the earth. It was suspended in mid-air, hanging from what appeared to be nothing, It swung back and forth, eerily rhythmic, with no source of movement, no rope, no wire. The light pulsed in a strange, unnatural beat, like a heart beating in time with her own, and standing in front of it was the figure. Now that it was in full view, the horror of it struck her like a physical blow. The figure was tall, too tall, its head almost scraping the canopy above. The body was cloaked in tattered rags of black fabric, hanging loose like the remnants of something long dead, and its limbs were twisted in unnatural angles, moving like those of an insect. The face was obscured by a dark hood, but the eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, burned through the darkness, penetrating her with a gaze that made her feel as though her very soul was being pierced. The figure didn't move at first. It simply stood, waiting, watching, and that's when she realized something worse. The footsteps hadn't stopped. They had never stopped. The splashing, the soft, wet sound that had haunted them through the entire forest was now growing louder, closer, echoing from all directions, but there was no one else in the clearing. No one that Mara could see, anyway. Something was moving somewhere, just outside the reach of the lantern's light. Something was circling them, just out of sight, stalking them from the fog. She could hear its breath now, deep and ragged, like something trying to hold itself back, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere. It was low, guttural, the words twisted and broken, like something ancient and lost, trying to find its way back to the surface. Mara. It was her name again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a call. It was a command. The figure's lips didn't move, but the words vibrated through the very air, vibrating against the trees and through her bones, as though the earth itself was speaking. It wasn't just calling her, it was claiming her. Mara, the voice repeated, the sound growing darker, more insistent. The light from the lantern flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. You belong to me now. The world seemed to freeze, as though the entire forest had exhaled at once, a collective sigh of despair, and then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The figure in front of her didn't move, but the air around it began to swirl, like the pressure was building. The trees groaned in unison, their branches swaying violently, as if the wind had picked up to an unnatural force. The fog around them thickened to a near-solid mass, closing in tighter, pressing in from every direction, pushing them toward the center of the clearing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, almost deafening now. It was like something massive was moving through the fog, its presence becoming undeniable, its power radiating outward like a wave. But it wasn't the figure that was coming toward her. It was something else. A presence. Something older. Something far worse than they had realized. Mara. The voice was a low hiss now, a whispering breath right at her ear. It wasn't just one voice anymore, but dozens, hundreds, all layering over one another, all speaking in perfect harmony. You will join us. You will be part of the forest, part of the flood. The darkness is waiting. Before she could even comprehend what was happening, the ground beneath her feet broke apart again, and she felt herself falling. Her body pitched forward, her hands reaching for something, anything, to stop the descent. But there was nothing to hold on to. And just as she thought she might fall into the endless void, a pair of cold hands gripped her wrists, pulling her back into the darkness. The forest had claimed them. Mara's heart lurched in her chest as she felt herself yanked back, her body pulled violently from the edge of the abyss, the earth itself pulling away beneath her feet. She gasped for breath, her lungs aching with the force of the fall as her vision spun. The world around her seemed to tilt, swirling, warping. Her feet found purchase again on the muddy ground, but it was no longer solid. The earth felt soft, like it was swallowing her whole. a deep, sucking sensation that made her stomach turn. Before her, the mist clung to the forest like a living, breathing thing. The fog had become thick, so dense it felt like she was swimming through it, unable to breathe, to see, to understand what was real anymore. And though the voice in the darkness had stopped, though the presence had pulled back, it was still there, waiting, watching. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, feeling the weight of the cold, the oppressive wetness of the air. Her clothes stuck to her skin, heavy and sodden. But it wasn't just the rain that weighed her down. It was something else, something unnatural that clung to her, that clung to all of them, pulling them deeper into the forest's grip. "Mara, are you okay?" Emily's voice broke through the fog, fragile and uncertain, but it was a lifeline. Mara turned to see Emily, her face as pale as death, her eyes wide with terror, her hands trembling. Mara stopped herself. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she was okay. She didn't know if any of them were. The mist had parted slightly, and in the brief, eerie stillness, she noticed something that made her stomach twist. Lying just ahead, partially submerged in the rushing floodwaters, was a body. It wasn't a corpse, not exactly, but it was wrong. The figure was floating face down in the shallow water, half hidden by the muck and silt, as if it had been there for a long time, too long. The clothing was torn and tattered, stained with dark, almost black water, but it wasn't the appearance of the body that made Mara's blood run cold. It was the state of it. The body was bloated, unnaturally swollen, its skin stretched tight over the bones. The pale flesh had an eerie, translucent quality, as if it had been submerged in water far too long, the color of death setting into the veins beneath the skin. "Do you see that?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, filled with dread. Mara nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She took a hesitant step forward, her legs heavy, as if the very air around her had thickened and grown more difficult to navigate. She moved closer, her eyes fixed on the bloated figure. There was something so wrong about it, the way the water moved around the body, lapping against the limbs as if it were alive. It wasn't just floating, it was drifting, like it was being carried by an invisible current, pulled by something below the surface. And then something in the stillness shifted. A faint, hollow sound reached Mara's ears. At first it was just a whisper, almost imperceptible, like the sound of water bubbling beneath the surface. But then it became clearer, a slow, rhythmic sound, like the gurgle of something breathing. No, it wasn't breathing. It was speaking. Mara froze, her breath caught in her chest. The body didn't just float, it moved. The arms twitched slightly, unnaturally, the fingers curling into claws, digging into the mud beneath it. The head shifted, turning slightly in the water, as though responding to something. But it wasn't just the body that moved. No, there was something deeper, something lurking beneath the surface. The water around the body began to ripple, small waves forming in the stagnant floodwaters, and the figure's bloated eyes flickered open. They were milky white, opaque, the eyes staring blankly, but there was a faint flicker of movement behind them, the faintest hint of awareness. Mara stumbled back, her legs nearly giving out beneath her, as she grabbed Emily's arm to steady herself. "No, no, no. This isn't real," she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. "Please, let's just go," Emily pleaded, her voice quivering with terror, but her feet were rooted to the ground, unwilling to turn away from the figure in the water. And then the water began to churn. The body rose. It wasn't a smooth movement, like a person simply standing. No, this was something else, something unnatural. The figure lurched upward, the head jerking up first, eyes staring directly at Mara with a hollow, unnatural gaze. The skin of the face was stretched and discolored, the flesh translucent and thin, with patches of darkened veins running beneath the surface, pulsing like a diseased heart. God. Emily breathed, her voice barely audible. It's alive. But it wasn't alive. Not really. It was something else. Something trapped in the liminal space between life and death, between the drowned and the living. And as it rose from the water, more of its twisted body emerged from the muddy flood, the flesh sagging and dripping with the black, oily water, as though it had been marinating in it for years. Mara couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure was moving now, dragging itself from the depths of the floodwaters, the wet, bloated limbs shuddering as it pulled itself toward the group. Its mouth hung open, but it made no sound, except for that deep, guttural hum, that rhythmic gurgling that came from within its chest. It wasn't trying to speak, it was trying to call. The air around them seemed to grow colder as the thing, this drowned creature, began to move closer. The very ground beneath Mara felt wrong. There was something underneath it now, a low, vibrating hum that rose from the earth itself, making her teeth rattle. The figure's mouth opened wider, but no words came out, only more water dripping in sickening sloshes from its jaw. With every step it took, the mist around them grew thicker. The trees began to groan and bend, and the footsteps that had haunted them earlier began again, this time from all directions, swarming in closer. But it wasn't just the body that was moving toward them. It was the forest. Mara realized with a cold, sinking feeling that they weren't just being hunted. The land itself was alive, and it was feeding on them, slowly, steadily. Suddenly, as if the forest had decided it had waited long enough, the creature lurched forward with a speed that belied its grotesque appearance. The air thickened, the fog became unbearable, and the cold water splashed against Mara's legs as it reached for her. It wasn't trying to kill her. No, it wanted something more. It wanted her to join it. They all would. "Mara!" Emily screamed. "Run!" The words snapped her out of the trance. She turned. She ran. The ground shook as the creature let out a deep, rattling moan, the sound vibrating in her chest as she bolted forward. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Every instinct in her screamed to get away from the thing behind her, to escape the hunger in the air. But the forest was already closing in. And something in. The dark had begun to whisper her name again. The forest had become a living thing, a nightmare of shadows and whispers, swallowing them whole. Every step Mara took felt heavier, like the earth itself was pushing against her, pulling her down into the abyss. The mist closed in around her, the dense fog so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her, though she knew the others were still nearby, their frantic breaths just audible in the suffocating silence. "Keep running," Mara shouted, but her voice felt weak, lost in the fog that churned like something alive. They couldn't stop. They couldn't slow down. The creature, the drowned thing, was behind them, its footsteps never ceasing, its presence palpable in the thick air. Its call had grown louder, deeper, almost as if the very sound of it was being carried by the wind itself, wrapping around them, coaxing them closer, promising that there would be no escape. The woods had grown darker, the trees closing in with an unnatural tightness, the path they had been following now completely erased by the rising waters and the mist. Each branch seemed to curl and writhe, as if alive, watching them with dark, hungry eyes. The footsteps that followed them were no longer just sounds. They were a presence, a force pushing them forward, closing in on them from every direction. Mara's skin crawled with the sensation that they weren't just running from the creature. They were running from something much bigger, something deeper than they could understand. Behind her, Ryan stumbled, his legs giving way as he fell hard to the ground with a sickening thud. "I can't," he gasped, his voice filled with fear and exhaustion. "I can't keep going," Mara's heart lurched. "Ryan, get up!" she yelled, rushing back toward him, but as she did, she saw it. The figure, the drowned thing, was closer now, its bloated, sickly form emerging from the mist, its mouth hanging open, water spilling from it in unnatural quantities. Its hollow, vacant eyes locked onto Mara, the hunger in them more than obvious. Ryan struggled to push himself up, but his hands were shaking, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to run, but the earth beneath him seemed to shift, like the ground was no longer solid, as though it had become a part of the storm itself, swallowing him inch by inch. The air grew thicker, heavier, suffocating, and the very weight of the forest seemed to press down on him, forcing him back to his knees. "Ryan!" Emily screamed, but the sound of her voice was muted, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the fog. Mara turned to grab his arm, but before she could reach him, the ground beneath Ryan cracked, splitting open like a wound in the earth. The mud and water surged upward, and the force of it yanked him down, pulling him toward the abyss that had opened beneath them. "No!" Mara screamed. "Ryan, no!" But it was too late. With a single desperate gasp, Ryan was swallowed by the earth, his body vanishing into the depths as though it had never been there at all. Mara stumbled back in horror, but the figure was there, closer now, almost at arm's length, its eyes fixed on her, its lips stretching into a twisted, grotesque grin. It didn't move toward her. Instead, it watched her, as if savoring the fear coursing through her veins, drinking in the terror that radiated from her very core. The forest had shifted. She didn't have time to think. She couldn't stop. Mara tore her eyes away from the creature and looked ahead, her breath ragged as her feet scrambled through the mud. Emily was already running, her face pale, her eyes filled with raw panic, but Mara couldn't look back. She couldn't think about anything but moving forward, moving toward whatever light might still be left in the darkness. The world around them had begun to change again. The trees twisted and groaned, their bark slick with water, their branches swaying unnaturally, as if pulled by invisible hands. The mist seemed to part and then close in again, moving with a life of its own, pushing them forward, trapping them in a space where time had no meaning. The world had become unnaturally still, the storm's roar silenced, the rain now a mere whisper in the distance. It was as if the very landscape had fallen into a deep, eternal night. And then, through the fog, Mara saw it. A faint glimmer of light. A soft, pale glow far in the distance, shining like a beacon of hope. She didn't question it. She didn't ask why it was there. She just ran toward it, dragging Emily with her, their feet slipping on the slick, wet earth. But the closer they got to the light, the more the forest seemed to shift and contort. The shadows grew longer, the fog thickened, and the light, once so bright, dimmed, flickering like a candle caught in a draught. Mara's stomach twisted with dread as she realized what was happening. The light wasn't guiding them toward escape. It was pulling them in. "Don't go toward it," Emily cried, her voice breaking. "We have to turn back. It's not real." But Mara couldn't stop. It was as though her legs were moving on their own, carrying her forward despite her mind screaming for her to turn around, to break free from whatever force had a grip on her. The glow, distant but undeniable, burned into her vision, a false promise of salvation. And then, just as she was about to reach it, the ground beneath them cracked wide open. Mara's scream was cut short as the earth buckled beneath her feet. Emily's hand slipped from hers as they both fell, the world spinning, collapsing into the dark abyss that had suddenly opened up beneath them. It wasn't just the earth breaking apart. It was the entire forest. The last thing Mara saw before. She was consumed by the darkness was the figure, the drowned thing, standing at the edge of the chasm, its hollow eyes glowing, its mouth open in a silent, gurgling scream, and then nothing. Mara awoke with a start, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands gripped the damp ground beneath her as she pulled herself up. The air was thick and wet, the sound of dripping water filling her ears, but something was wrong. Everything felt wrong. She looked around. The forest was gone. The fog was gone. The storm was gone. There was nothing but a thick, oppressive silence and a void stretching endlessly before her. Then, as she looked around again, she saw them. Emily, Jack, Ryan, all standing in front of her, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, as though they had never left. But they weren't the same. They were drowned, and behind them, standing still and silent, was the figure, the one that had haunted their every step. It had won. The forest had claimed them. Mara's body went cold as she realized that there would never be an escape. They were part of the darkness now.